The snow falls softly outside, whitening the streets, polishing the lie. Inside, gaslight trembles against polished mirrors and velvet drapes. Silverware gleams. Laughter is practiced. And beneath the hymns and holly of a Victorian Christmas, something far less holy waits, a fine white powder hidden in snuff boxes, medicine tins, and silk-lined drawers. This is not indulgence in the crude sense. This is refinement, science, control. Victorian high society worshipped composure. At Christmas, that worship became merciless. Endless visits, late dinners, relentless cheer. Women expected to glow with serenity. Men required to perform brilliance without fatigue. Weakness was vulgar. Melancholy was moral failure. And so chemistry stepped in where faith and rest could not. Cocaine, praised by doctors, endorsed by journals, and sold openly by chemists, offered alertness without drunkenness, confidence without collapse. A miracle powder for a season that demanded perfection. If you enjoy stories that peel back the velvet curtain of history, the rituals, the secrets, the quiet addictions hidden behind respectability, subscribe now and stay with me. And tell me where you're listening from tonight, as this story drifts through candlelight and cold air, because this Christmas tale was never meant for carol books. It was meant to stay buried beneath etiquette and lace. Tonight, we uncover why Victorian high society embraced cocaine not as vice, but as virtue, and how a season devoted to salvation became one of silent chemical surrender. Christmas arrived in Victorian London, dressed as innocents. Snow softened the streets, muting the clatter of carriage wheels and sealing soot beneath a temporary purity. Gaslight glimmered through frost-veined windows, turning drawing rooms into warm islands against the cold. From the outside, these houses appeared tranquil, ordered, moral, and complete. But inside, beneath the polished furniture and evergreen garlands, the season pressed hard on the human body. This was not a holiday of rest. It was a test. Christmas demanded visibility. One was expected to be seen calling on acquaintances, hosting dinners, attending services, performing joy with precision. Silence was suspicious, withdrawal impolite, fatigue unacceptable. The season insisted upon movement, conversation, and composure, regardless of the toll. For the wealthy, the burden was heavier still. Servants could falter behind doors, but their employers were required to glow. Behind lace curtains, the air was heavy with heat and expectation. Parlors filled with layered scents, coal, smoke, wax, citrus peel, perfume. The body, trapped in corsetry and wool, was not designed for this. Heads ached, hands trembled, hearts raced beneath starched shirts. But such discomfort was not acknowledged aloud. It was managed quietly, with the same discretion applied to debts and indiscretions. And this is where the drawer came in. Not every drawer, and not every house, but enough. A small compartment in a writing desk, a velvet-lined box beneath gloves and calling cards, a container that did not look like medicine at all. Within it rested a substance described not as indulgence, but as aid, a white powder praised in lectures, endorsed in journals, and sold without alarm by respectable chemists. Cocaine did not arrive as scandal. It arrived as reassurance. At first, it was spoken of in clinical terms. A stimulant, yes, but a refined one. It did not dull the mind like alcohol. It did not sink the spirit like opium. It sharpened, lifted, clarified. In an age obsessed with progress, this mattered. The Victorians trusted chemistry. They believed modern science could improve the body the way machinery improved labor. Christmas, with its relentless demands, became the perfect proving ground. A discreet amount dissolved fatigue. Another quieted hunger. A third steadied the nerves before an evening of enforced brilliance. No smoke, no syringe, no telltale signs, just a temporary correction, or so it seemed, to a body that had failed to keep pace with expectation. What made this possible was not recklessness, but confidence. Confidence in doctors who spoke with certainty. Confidence in empire, which delivered exotic remedies from distant lands. Confidence that refinement itself was a form of protection. This was not the behavior of those who thought themselves sinful. It was the habit of people who believed they were doing exactly what modern life required. Outside, bells rang for midnight services. Inside, a hostess straightened her posture, her exhaustion briefly erased. A gentleman found his words flowing more easily, his laughter sharper, his presence assured. Guests saw only success, a Christmas executed flawlessly. What they did not see was the small, deliberate action taken earlier in the day. The drawer opened, the powder measured. The season survived. Snow continued to fall. Respectability remained intact, and the secret stayed where it belonged, hidden beneath polished surfaces, waiting for the next demand, the next gathering, the next Christmas that would ask more of the body than it could naturally give. Joy, in Victorian society, was not an emotion. It was a duty. Christmas did not arrive as an invitation to rest, but as a command performance, issued by custom and enforced by watchful eyes. To be cheerful was not optional. To be animated was expected. To falter to show weariness, irritability, or gloom was to reveal a flaw of character. The season tolerated no hesitation. It moved forward with bells, schedules, and social obligation, indifferent to the body's quiet protests. Festive cheer was measured in appearances: who attended which dinner, who hosted which gathering, who sang, smiled, spoke brightly, and remained standing long after the fire had burned low. Absence was noticed. Declining an invitation invited speculation. Even illness, unless dramatic and unmistakable, was treated with suspicion. Fatigue had no moral weight. It was not an excuse. It was a weakness. The Victorian world prized discipline above comfort. Emotional restraint was proof of breeding. Physical endurance was proof of worth. Christmas intensified both. The season compressed weeks of social expectation into a narrow window, demanding constant readiness. One was expected to wake early, receive guests, dress formally, converse with precision, dine heavily, attend services, and repeat the cycle without complaint. Sleep was secondary. Appetite inconvenient. Silence impolite. For women, the pressure was unrelenting. The home was their stage, and Christmas its most scrutinized performance. Decorations had to be perfect, meals timed exactly, guests entertained with effortless grace. A hostess who appeared strained had failed. A woman who confessed exhaustion invited diagnosis, nervous weakness, hysteria, deficiency of constitution. There was no cultural language for overwork. There was only inadequacy. Men were not spared. They were expected to be lively, authoritative, amusing. A dull man at Christmas was not merely boring, he was diminished. Conversation demanded sharpness. Wit had to sparkle without turning cruel. Confidence was mandatory, especially in public rooms heavy with judgment. To withdraw, to sit quietly, to show inwardness, these were indulgences reserved for solitude, not society. Behind the glow of candles and polished smiles, bodies rebelled, hearts raced, palms dampened, thoughts scattered. The nerves that fragile Victorian obsession frayed under the weight of forced brightness. But the culture did not interpret these signs as warnings. It interpreted them as obstacles to be overcome, and so cheer became tyrannical, not because happiness was despised, but because it was enforced. It had rules, it had timing, it had consequences. The season allowed no ambiguity. One was either festive or failing. The demand was not to feel joy, but to perform it convincingly enough that no one questioned the effort required. Medical language stepped in to support this cruelty. Doctors spoke of overstimulation and underrest not as social problems, but as individual imbalances. The body, they said, could be adjusted. The nerves strengthened, energy restored. If the season exhausted you, it was not the season at fault, it was your constitution. This belief carried comfort. It absolved society. It reassured the exhausted that their suffering was not structural, but solvable. Somewhere, there must be a remedy that would allow the body to meet expectation without complaint. A substance that could smooth the edges, lift the spirits, sharpen the mind, and silence the body's refusal to cooperate. Christmas, more than any other time of year, created the need for such solutions. It concentrated stress into ritual. It framed endurance as virtue, and it punished those who could not sustain the mask. Within this pressure cooker of goodwill and obligation, the idea of chemical assistance did not feel dangerous. It felt merciful. The tyranny was not loud. It did not shout. It smiled. It sang. It offered mince pies and hymns and good wishes and demanded, in return, that the human body rise to an impossible standard. Those who could not were left to find their own way to comply. Some found it in the quiet opening of a drawer. The Victorian home was not a refuge. It was a theatre. Gaslight revealed everything it touched, but it softened nothing. It cast a flattering glow while exposing movement, posture, and expression with merciless clarity. In drawing rooms trimmed with lace and gilt, every gesture was illuminated, every pause observed. Christmas intensified this scrutiny. Guests arrived in clusters, eyes lingered, conversations overlapped. The house became a chamber of quiet appraisal, where behavior was measured against expectation with unspoken precision. Surveillance in this world did not require guards or walls. It lived in glances, in pauses, in the polite tilt of a head. It thrived on proximity. A woman's composure was watched not as curiosity, but as evidence. A man's liveliness was assessed not for pleasure, but for adequacy. Too much animation suggested vulgarity. Too little invited concern. Balance was demanded, and it had to be maintained continuously. Lace served its purpose well. It concealed while it framed. Sleeves restricted the arms. Bodices constrained the breath. Clothing enforced stillness and control, shaping the body into a socially acceptable form. At Christmas, these constraints multiplied. Formal wear extended into hours never intended for such restraint. Corsetry tightened as dinners lengthened. Boots pinched as standing became unavoidable. The body was disciplined into compliance, and any sign of rebellion was interpreted as moral failure. The gaze of others made retreat impossible. To excuse oneself early was to announce fragility. To sit quietly was to invite questions. Even illness required performance dramatic enough to justify absence, but not so frequent as to suggest weakness of character. Privacy existed only in fragments, stolen between obligations, and even then, the memory of being seen lingered, shaping behavior long after the room emptied. This constant observation had consequences. The mind grew vigilant, the body learned tension. Shoulders lifted without awareness, breath shortened. The heart beat faster, not from exertion, but from anticipation, the knowledge that one was always on display. Christmas heightened this sensation. The season transformed homes into corridors of passage, through which acquaintances moved freely, carrying judgment with them. The servants watched too, though differently. They noticed tremors, pallor, hurried movements between rooms. They saw the exhaustion behind the smiles, but were trained to ignore it. Silence was part of service. Discretion was survival. The house absorbed strain without acknowledging it, maintaining its appearance at any cost. In such an environment, rest became suspicious. A body at ease was a body unguarded. To relax one's expression risked revealing dissatisfaction. To withdraw one's attention risked appearing disengaged. Vigilance was the safest posture, but vigilance could not be sustained indefinitely. The nervous system faltered, concentration blurred, irritation surfaced uninvited. Victorian culture did not recognize this as harm inflicted by constant observation. It interpreted these symptoms as individual defects, weak nerves, sensitive temperament, insufficient stamina. The solution, therefore, was not to reduce scrutiny, but to fortify the individual against it. The world would not soften. The body must adapt. Chemistry offered a way forward, a substance that sharpened awareness without revealing strain, one that steadied the hands, quickened the mind, and restored confidence under scrutiny. Cocaine promised precisely this. It did not dull the senses, it heightened them. It did not encourage withdrawal, it enabled participation. Under its influence, the gaze of others felt manageable. The room seemed less hostile. Conversation flowed. Surveillance became tolerable. This was its quiet appeal. Not escape, but endurance. Not rebellion, but compliance made easier. The powder did not challenge the rules of the room. It allowed one to survive them. Gaslight continued to glow. Lace continued to bind. The eyes of others remained fixed. But somewhere, beneath the surface of propriety, a new ally waited, ready to steady the nerves, sharpen the smile, and make the body appear as composed as society demanded it be. Christmas did not unfold as a single celebration. It moved in a circuit. Days were mapped in advance, not by rest or reflection, but by obligation. Morning calls, afternoon teas, evening dinners, services attended, then repeated. Each visit fed into the next, forming an unbroken chain of appearances that wound through parlors, dining rooms, and vestibules with mechanical regularity. To participate was expected, to falter was remembered. The circuit was unforgiving in its precision. Timing mattered. One arrived neither too early nor too late. One stayed long enough to be seen, but not so long as to overstay. Each house demanded its own performance, subtly adjusted to its occupants, its hierarchies, its unspoken tensions. The body became a vehicle for constant recalibration, posture altered, tone softened or sharpened, laughter measured carefully against the room. This was not leisure, it was labor disguised as festivity. Travel between homes compounded the strain. Winter streets were slick with ice and soot. Carriages rattled, jolting already fatigued bodies. Boots soaked through, gloves stiffened in the cold. By the time one arrived, cheeks flushed not with joy, but with exertion. There was no allowance for recovery. Hospitality required immediate engagement. Warmth came with scrutiny. Tea was poured. Questions asked. Smiles demanded. The visits multiplied as Christmas approached. What began as a manageable schedule swelled into excess. Declining an invitation was rarely neutral. It suggested slight, disinterest, or worse, incapacity. Social standing was reinforced by endurance. Those who managed the circuit without visible strain earned quiet admiration. Those who could not were gently discussed, their constitutions assessed like fragile objects. Women bore the heaviest burden. Their presence was essential, their absence conspicuous. They were expected not only to attend, but to remember names, manage children, receive compliments, deflect criticisms, and absorb commentary without visible reaction. Fatigue showed first in them, in the tightening of mouths, the dulling of eyes, the slight tremor of hands. These signs were noticed. They were never forgiven. Men faced a different expectation, but no lighter one. They were required to move confidently from house to house, maintaining authority and humor. They were judged by their energy, their sharpness, their command of conversation. A man who appeared weary risked seeming diminished. A man who withdrew risked suspicion. The circuit allowed no pause for introspection. Between visits, there was barely time to breathe. Meals were eaten hastily or skipped entirely. Sleep came late and ended early. The body, denied recovery, began to protest. Headaches formed behind the eyes, the pulse quickened unpredictably, thoughts scattered. Yet the circuit continued, indifferent to these signs. It rewarded completion, not well-being. Victorian culture framed this endurance as virtue. The ability to withstand Christmas was proof of discipline. It demonstrated social fitness. To survive the circuit was to affirm one's place within it. There was no language for excess. There was only the quiet assumption that those who struggled were insufficiently prepared. It was within this relentless movement that chemical assistance found its footing. Cocaine offered something uniquely suited to the circuit. It did not require privacy or elaborate preparation. A discreet dose could be taken quickly, restoring clarity before the next door opened. It masked fatigue without announcing itself. It sharpened the senses without blunting decorum. Under its influence, the circuit felt manageable. Distances shortened, conversation flowed more easily. The body, briefly relieved of its resistance, complied. The powder did not end the circuit. It made it survivable. And so the visits continued. One house blurred into the next. Snow fell, then melted under carriage wheels. Bells rang. Doors opened and closed. Somewhere between one threshold and another, the drawer was opened again, not in desperation, but in calculation, ensuring that the body would keep pace with a season that demanded motion without mercy. Respectability was not a state of being, it was work. In Victorian society, virtue did not exist independently of effort. It had to be demonstrated continuously through posture, speech, timing, and restraint. Christmas intensified this demand, transforming respectability into a full occupation. The season did not reward sincerity, it rewarded consistency. One had to appear proper at all times, regardless of internal strain. The body became an instrument tasked with sustaining appearances long after its capacity had been exceeded. This labor was invisible by design. To admit effort was to undermine the illusion. Respectability depended on ease, the appearance that grace, composure, and endurance came naturally. A woman who seemed to manage Christmas effortlessly was praised not for her stamina, but for her refinement. A man who maintained authority without visible fatigue was admired not for discipline, but for character. The work itself was denied even as it consumed those performing it. Every gesture required calculation. How long to speak, when to smile, when to excuse oneself without appearing weak. Even the expression of pleasure had to be measured, neither too restrained nor too eager. Excessive enthusiasm suggested vulgarity. Insufficient animation implied disinterest. Balance was everything, and maintaining it demanded constant attention. The body paid the price first. Muscles tightened from sustained posture. Breath shortened beneath restrictive clothing. Sleep fractured into shallow intervals. Appetite was sacrificed to scheduling. But these costs were treated as incidental, not consequential. The culture did not recognize them as evidence of strain. It recognized only outcomes: the successful dinner, the polished conversation, the flawless visit. Women were trained from an early age to accept this labor as natural. Their worth was inseparable from their ability to maintain harmony. At Christmas, they were expected to orchestrate comfort for others while erasing their own discomfort. Hosting was framed as pleasure, not responsibility. To struggle was to fail quietly. To succeed was to disappear behind the smooth functioning of the household. Men labored differently, but no less intensely. Their respectability was tied to control of self, of environment, of others. Christmas demanded public presence. They were expected to be engaged, generous, decisive. To appear overwhelmed was to appear incompetent. Fatigue threatened authority. It had to be managed, not acknowledged. This constant performance created a peculiar contradiction. Respectability was meant to signal moral strength, yet it depended on suppressing the body's signals. Pain, exhaustion, and emotional depletion were treated as disruptions rather than warnings. The body was something to be disciplined into submission, not listened to. When it faltered, the response was not rest, but correction. Medical discourse reinforced this view. Doctors spoke of strengthening the constitution, fortifying the nerves, restoring balance. They did not question the demands placed upon their patients. They accepted them as inevitable. The task of medicine was to make the individual fit the world, not to make the world humane. Within this framework, chemical assistance was not subversive, it was practical. Cocaine entered respectable life not as rebellion, but as efficiency. It offered energy without intoxication, confidence without disarray. It allowed the labor of respectability to continue uninterrupted. Under its influence, the body appeared obedient again. The work resumed. This was the unspoken exchange. Respectability demanded everything. In return, it offered status, security, and belonging. Those who wished to remain within its bounds learned to treat their bodies as tools adjustable, correctable, expendable. Christmas merely revealed this truth more clearly than any other season. Behind the polished surface of virtue lay exhaustion, managed carefully and quietly. The labor continued, and when the body could no longer sustain it alone, chemistry stepped in to carry the load discreetly, efficiently, and without challenging the system that made such labor necessary. Rest was a luxury Victorian women were not permitted to possess. Christmas made this prohibition unmistakable. The season transformed the home into a public arena and women into its primary machinery. Every ribbon, every course, every carefully timed visit bore their imprint. Yet the expectation was not that they work, but that the work remain invisible. Effortless grace was the standard. Fatigue was a personal failure. From the moment the season approached, demands accumulated. Decorations had to be arranged according to fashion. Menus planned with precision. Servants instructed, corrected, and supervised. Family obligations layered atop social ones. Visits received, visits returned. Children managed, guests soothed. Every detail required attention, and none allowed acknowledgement of strain. The female body absorbed this pressure silently. Clothing restricted movement and breath. Corsets tightened as the day progressed, compressing ribs already weary from long hours upright. Shoes pinched. Gloves rubbed skin raw. Meals were eaten hurriedly or not at all. Sleep came late, broken by anticipation of the next day's obligations. Yet none of this was recognized as cause for concern. It was simply assumed. Medical language offered little relief. When women complained of exhaustion, headaches, palpitations, or dizziness, the diagnosis rarely addressed workload. Instead, their bodies were labeled delicate, their nerves oversensitive. The problem was framed as intrinsic rather than imposed. Treatment focused on calming, strengthening, or stimulating the individual woman, never on reducing what was demanded of her. Christmas intensified this imbalance. The season carried emotional expectations as heavy as its logistical ones. Women were expected to embody warmth, generosity, and serenity regardless of internal state. Irritation was unacceptable, withdrawal impolite, tears embarrassing. The role permitted no fractures. One performed joy, not because it was felt, but because it was required. The consequence was a body constantly overridden. Signals of fatigue were ignored until they became impossible to suppress. Fainting spells, trembling hands, racing thoughts, these were not seen as warnings, but as inconveniences to be managed discreetly. Women learned to fear their own limits, viewing them as evidence of inadequacy rather than boundaries deserving respect. Within this environment, chemical assistance found fertile ground. Cocaine offered something uniquely suited to the expectations placed upon women. It suppressed appetite, reducing the need to eat during long days of hosting. It lifted mood, smoothing irritability into sociability. It provided energy without the coarseness associated with alcohol and without the heavy sedation of opiates. It promised control. Importantly, it could be used privately. A small dose taken away from view restored composure before the next obligation. There were no obvious signs, no disruption of decorum. The woman returned to the room steady, attentive, and agreeable precisely as required. The substance did not free her from expectation. It enabled her to endure it. This endurance was praised. A hostess who managed the season flawlessly was admired without inquiry into how such perfection was achieved. Her success reinforced the system that demanded it. Her exhaustion remained unseen, her reliance unspoken. Christmas passed each year in this manner. Decorations came down. Dresses were folded away. The body, depleted, was expected to recover quietly before the cycle resumed. But the lesson remained. Rest was indulgent, while endurance was virtuous. Assistance that made endurance possible was therefore justified. Women who could not rest learned instead to adapt. They adjusted themselves chemically to meet the season's demands, sacrificing long-term well-being for immediate compliance. In doing so, they upheld the very ideals that denied them relief, maintaining the illusion that such labor required no toll, and that the female body, properly managed, could sustain anything asked of it. Victorian masculinity was measured not by rest, but by command. A man was expected to arrive in every room fully formed, alert, articulate, and unburdened by the weaknesses of the body. Christmas sharpened this expectation. The season demanded presence. Dinners ran long. Conversations stretched late into the night. Political opinions were exchanged. Business alliances hinted at. Stories retold with practiced ease. A man who flagged was not pitied. He was diminished. Fatigue had no acceptable expression. To admit exhaustion was to suggest fragility. To retreat early was to signal disinterest or incompetence. The ideal man remained composed regardless of circumstance, his mind sharp, his speech confident, his authority intact. Christmas gatherings became examinations, quietly assessing whether a man could sustain his role under pressure. The demands were subtle but relentless. He was expected to lead conversation without dominating it, to be entertaining without excess, to demonstrate intelligence without pedantry. He had to remain attentive through hours of social engagement, even as his body protested the strain. Sleep deprivation was common, meals were heavy but irregular. Alcohol flowed freely, yet intoxication was dangerous. Too much loosened control, too little invited suspicion. Balance was everything. Behind closed doors, men experienced the same physiological limits as anyone else. Their hearts raced, their concentration wavered, irritability surfaced unexpectedly. But these signs were interpreted not as natural responses to overextension, but as failures of self-mastery. The culture taught men to distrust their bodies, to treat physical limitation as something to be conquered. Medical discourse reinforced this attitude. Doctors spoke of nervous exhaustion and mental fatigue, but framed them as conditions to be corrected rather than signals to slow down. Remedies were offered that promised restoration without retreat. The message was clear. A capable man should not withdraw from obligation. He should adjust himself until he could continue. Cocaine fit this message perfectly. It sharpened focus. It quickened speech. It restored a sense of confidence that fatigue had dulled. Unlike alcohol, it did not blur judgment. Unlike opium, it did not soften resolve. It made a man feel capable again, not euphoric, but efficient. Under its influence, conversation flowed. Ideas seemed clearer. The effort required to maintain authority diminished. Its appeal was particularly strong during Christmas, when demands clustered tightly together. A man might attend multiple dinners in succession, each requiring fresh energy and attention. There was little opportunity for recovery. Cocaine offered continuity. A discreet dose taken before an evening engagement allowed him to perform as though the day's exertions had not occurred. Importantly, its use carried little stigma. It was associated with modern medicine, not vice. It was discussed in clinical terms, prescribed or recommended by professionals. A man who relied on it could tell himself he was being practical, even responsible. He was not indulging. He was maintaining standards. This rationalization mattered. Victorian masculinity depended on the belief that one's authority was earned, not propped up. To acknowledge dependence on a substance would have undermined that belief. Cocaine's framing as medicine preserved the illusion of self-sufficiency. The man remained in control, or so it appeared. As Christmas passed, the pattern repeated. Social obligations blurred into professional ones. The same substance that sustained wit during festive dinners began to sustain concentration during work. What had begun as seasonal assistance became habitual support. The line between need and convenience thinned quietly. Men continued to be admired for their endurance. Their fatigue remained hidden. Their reliance went unspoken. The season passed, leaving behind a reinforced expectation that a man worth respecting would always be ready, always capable, and never visibly worn down by the demands placed upon him. Cocaine did not create this ideal. It simply made it possible to inhabit, at least for a while, without acknowledging the cost. Melancholy had no safe place in Victorian Christmas. Sadness was not understood as a natural response to strain, loss, or exhaustion. It was treated as deviation, a sign that something within the individual had gone awry. At Christmas, this judgment sharpened. The season was framed as proof of moral health. To feel low when the world insisted upon cheer was not merely unfortunate, it was suspect. The culture allowed little distinction between emotion and character. A person who could not summon joy was assumed to lack discipline, gratitude, or proper constitution. Melancholy suggested weakness of will. It hinted at ingratitude for comfort and privilege. In a society that prized control, inward darkness was seen not as human, but as defective. This belief was reinforced relentlessly through ritual. Hymns spoke of peace and goodwill. Sermons praised contentment and humility. Greeting cards depicted harmony unmarred by fatigue or grief. The message was consistent and inescapable. Happiness was expected. If it did not arrive naturally, one was responsible for its absence. For those already strained by the season's demands, this expectation became a burden in itself. Exhaustion blurred into low spirits. Irritation softened into sadness. The body's depletion manifested emotionally, but the culture refused to recognize the connection. Instead, it diagnosed the result as personal failing. Women bore this judgment with particular severity. A woman who appeared subdued risked being labeled fragile or unstable. Her emotional state was scrutinized as evidence of nervous disorder. Men faced a different accusation, that melancholy signaled a lack of vigor, ambition, or authority. In either case, sadness diminished social standing. Medical discourse absorbed these assumptions seamlessly. Melancholy was discussed as a condition rooted in the nerves, the blood, or the brain, something to be corrected rather than understood. Treatment aimed not at alleviating causes, but at suppressing symptoms. The goal was restoration of function, not emotional truth. Christmas provided the perfect justification for intervention. If the season demanded joy, then medicine could be tasked with producing it. Doctors spoke of restoring spirits, lifting mood, banishing gloom. Substances were evaluated not by their long-term effects, but by their ability to return the patient to usefulness quickly. Cocaine, in this context, appeared almost virtuous. It did not sedate sadness into silence. It replaced it with energy. It sharpened perception, increased engagement, and produced a sense of confidence that masqueraded as happiness. A person who had felt heavy and withdrawn could, after a small dose, re-enter the social world with renewed animation. This transformation was seductive. It seemed to confirm the belief that melancholy was a correctable flaw rather than a meaningful signal. If sadness vanished under chemical influence, then it must never have been justified. The substance validated the culture's refusal to listen to the body and the mind. Importantly, cocaine did not advertise itself as emotional alteration. It was framed as stimulation, as restoration of normal function. The joy that followed was presented as evidence of health returning, not mood being manufactured. This distinction mattered. It allowed individuals to accept the result without questioning the process. Christmas gatherings offered immediate proof. A person who had struggled earlier in the day appeared suddenly brighter, more engaged, more pleasant. The change was welcomed without inquiry. No one asked what had been required to achieve it. The visible outcome mattered more than the invisible cost. Over time, the association hardened. Melancholy became something to be avoided at all costs, particularly during festive periods. The body's signals of depletion were reinterpreted as obstacles to be overcome chemically. Emotional endurance joined physical endurance as a measure of worth. Thus, sadness was not merely discouraged, it was medicalized, corrected, and quietly erased. In its place stood a brighter, sharper presence, one that satisfied social expectation while concealing the growing reliance beneath. Christmas demanded joy, chemistry delivered it, and the culture, relieved of discomfort, asked no further questions. There came a moment, often unnoticed at first, when the body stopped cooperating. It was not dramatic. There was no single collapse, no unmistakable crisis that demanded intervention. Instead, resistance emerged quietly, in small failures that accumulated across the days of Christmas. A hand that trembled when lifting a teacup, a heartbeat that raced without cause, a sudden blankness in the middle of familiar conversation. These were not signs the season acknowledged. They were irritations to be managed, inconveniences interrupting the performance. Victorian culture taught its people to distrust these signals. The body, it was believed, should submit to discipline. If it did not, something within it must be malfunctioning. Christmas, with its compressed demands and relentless visibility, accelerated this conflict. The season asked for more than the body could sustainably provide, and when the body objected, it was treated as disobedient. Sleep fractured first. Nights stretched late with obligation, mornings arrived early with expectation. Rest, when it came, was shallow and incomplete. The nervous system remained alert even in darkness, anticipating the next demand. Appetite followed. Meals were heavy yet unsatisfying, eaten quickly or skipped entirely. Digestion slowed. Discomfort settled in the chest and abdomen, dismissed as trivial. As depletion deepened, emotional regulation faltered. Irritation surfaced unexpectedly. Patience thinned. Moments that should have brought pleasure instead produced a sense of dread. But these experiences were rarely named honestly. They were reframed as personal shortcomings, signs of weak nerves or poor temperament. The culture allowed no space for acknowledging that the season itself might be harmful. Medical advice reinforced this denial. Doctors spoke of exhaustion, but not as consequence. They spoke of nervous imbalance, of overstimulation or insufficiency, of constitutions unable to withstand modern life. The implied solution was adjustment, not retreat. The body was to be corrected, not indulged. Christmas sharpened this urgency. The calendar allowed no pause for recovery. Visits continued, dinners multiplied, services repeated. Each obligation arrived indifferent to the body's condition. To withdraw was to admit failure. To persist required intervention. It was here, at the point of refusal, that chemical assistance ceased to be optional. Cocaine shifted from convenience to necessity, from enhancement to correction. It addressed precisely the symptoms the season produced: fatigue lifted, appetite suppressed, mood elevated, focus restored. The body, temporarily overridden, resumed its duties. The relief was immediate and convincing. The tremor stilled, the heart felt steadier. Conversation flowed again. The user interpreted this as recovery rather than suppression. The substance appeared to fix what had gone wrong, confirming the belief that the body's resistance had been pathological rather than protective. This misinterpretation mattered. It reframed warning signs as errors, reinforcing the impulse to silence them rather than respond. Each time the body refused, chemistry intervened. Each intervention taught the user to distrust sensation, to treat discomfort as something to be eliminated rather than understood. Christmas rewarded this behavior. The individual who persisted despite strain was praised. The hostess, who completed the season without visible collapse, was admired. The gentleman, who maintained sharpness through every gathering, earned respect. The means by which this endurance was achieved remained invisible, protected by discretion and social politeness. Yet beneath the surface, a shift had occurred. The body learned that refusal would not be honored. Its signals were no longer sufficient to slow the pace. Chemical override became the new baseline. What had begun as seasonal assistance hardened into habit, not through desire, but through necessity imposed by expectation. The season ended eventually, as all seasons do. Decorations were stored, visits ceased, the calendar loosened its grip. But the lesson remained embedded. When the body resists, silence it. When it falters, correct it. When it refuses, override it. The body had spoken, the season had answered, and chemistry had ensured that the answer favored endurance over care, compliance over rest, a pattern that would not easily dissolve once Christmas passed. The appeal for assistance did not arrive as desperation. It came as reason. By the time Christmas reached its height, exhaustion had become ordinary. Sleeplessness was expected. Frayed nerves were commonplace. What distinguished one household from another was not whether strain existed, but how discreetly it was managed. The season did not ask if help was needed. It assumed adaptation would occur. Victorians were adept at framing necessity as progress. When the body faltered under the pressure of modern life, the solution was not to question the pressure, but to refine the individual. Chemistry promised refinement. It offered adjustment without disruption, correction without confession. The holiday season, relentless and compressed, became the clearest demonstration of this philosophy. A cry for help, in this context, did not sound like complaint. It sounded like inquiry. A question asked quietly of a physician, a suggestion offered between acquaintances, a remark about fatigue framed not as suffering, but as inefficiency. The language was practical, the tone reassuring. There was no panic, only the shared understanding that something must be done to keep the machinery running. Doctors obliged readily. The medical profession was steeped in the belief that modern ailments required modern solutions. Christmas fatigue was not treated as overwork. It was classified as nervous depletion, a temporary imbalance correctable through stimulation. Cocaine, newly extracted and enthusiastically studied, fit the need perfectly. It was modern, precise, and measurable. It promised clarity rather than chaos. Prescriptions were written with confidence. Dosages discussed clinically. The substance was not framed as escape, but as aid, a tool to restore function, a means to preserve dignity. For patients who feared appearing weak, this framing mattered. Accepting chemical help did not feel like surrender. It felt like responsibility. The timing was critical. Christmas allowed no margin for prolonged recovery. Guests were expected, duties scheduled. There was no socially acceptable interval for collapse. Cocaine offered immediacy. Its effects arrived quickly, smoothing fatigue before it became visible. This speed reinforced trust. A substance that worked so efficiently, seemed to validate the reasoning behind its use. Word spread quietly, not through scandal, but through success. A hostess who appeared remarkably composed despite the season's demands, a gentleman whose energy never seemed to flag. Observations were made, questions asked discreetly. The answer, when offered, was couched in medical language. It was not indulgence, it was assistance. What emerged was a collective adaptation to impossible expectation. Christmas demanded endurance beyond natural limits. Chemistry supplied it. The exchange felt logical, even benevolent. No one spoke of dependence. The focus remained on results, the successful dinner, the polished visit, the uninterrupted performance of joy. The moral dimension was carefully preserved. Because the substance was sanctioned by medicine, its use did not threaten respectability. It aligned with Victorian faith in progress. If industry could be improved by machinery, why should the human body be different? Christmas became the testing ground for this belief, proving that chemistry could sustain tradition rather than disrupt it. Yet beneath this confidence lay a quiet unease. The need for assistance was increasing. The body's natural capacity was no longer sufficient. Each season seemed to demand more, not less. The cry for help, once exceptional, was becoming routine. But this observation remained unspoken. To voice it would have required questioning the structure itself. Instead, the drawer was opened again. The powder measured, the day resumed. Christmas continued, intact and shining, supported by an invisible network of chemical correction. The season ended as it always had, with relief disguised as satisfaction. But the precedent remained. When tradition exceeded the body's limits, the answer was not retreat, but refinement. The cry for help had been answered not by rest or mercy, but by chemistry. Long before it entered the drawing room, the powder began as a leaf. High in distant mountains, far beyond the reach of gaslight and carriages, coca had grown quietly for centuries. It was not refined, it was not fashionable. It belonged to landscapes the Victorian imagination flattened into abstractions: altitude, jungle, empire. Indigenous hands harvested it, dried it, chewed it, respected its limits. There, it was endurance tempered by ritual, not excess disguised as improvement. When the leaf crossed oceans, it did not arrive intact. It was transformed. Victorian science approached coca with the confidence of conquest. Chemists stripped the leaf of context, isolating its active properties with surgical precision. What remained was not tradition, but potential, a substance purified of culture, history, and restraint. The process itself was celebrated as triumph. Nature had been improved. Mystery rendered measurable. This transformation mattered deeply. A leaf carried associations of the primitive, the foreign, the uncontrolled. A powder, extracted and labeled, carried authority. It could be weighed, prescribed, studied. Its origins dissolved into technical language. By the time cocaine reached Britain, it no longer belonged to mountains or people. It belonged to science. Medical journals spoke of it with excitement. Reports described increased endurance, sharpened focus, elevated spirits. The substance seemed to offer exactly what modern life demanded: energy without collapse, stimulation without drunkenness, control without surrender. It was framed not as alteration, but as optimization, the body refined to meet the pace of progress. Empire played its part silently. Coca's journey was made possible by trade routes that delivered raw materials from distant lands to metropolitan centers. This movement was normalized. Substances arrived, stripped of origin, ready for application. The ethics of extraction were rarely considered. What mattered was availability. Christmas, with its concentrated demands, benefited directly from this global machinery. The leaf's transformation into powder paralleled the Victorian relationship with the human body. Both were treated as raw material. Both were subjected to refinement. Both were expected to perform beyond natural limits once properly processed. The logic was consistent. If industry could extract value from distant lands, medicine could extract performance from flesh. Cocaine's foreign origin added to its appeal. It carried the aura of the exotic without the inconvenience of difference. It was empire made consumable, distant, powerful, and obedient. Its effects were immediate, its use discreet. The substance promised not escape from society, but deeper integration into it. Christmas accelerated this process. The season demanded resources beyond local supply, emotional, physical, social. Cocaine, born of distant mountains, filled the gap. It was modern life borrowing strength from elsewhere, without acknowledging the cost. The leaf's journey erased its original boundaries. What had once been used sparingly within cultural limits was now consumed freely under the banner of progress. Dosage replaced ritual. Prescription replaced tradition. The substance's power was no longer moderated by communal knowledge, but by individual judgment shaped by expectation. This mattered profoundly. Cocaine entered Victorian life already abstracted, already detached from restraint. Its users encountered it not as a tool requiring respect, but as a solution validated by authority. The leaf had been transformed into an answer before the question was fully understood. By the time Christmas arrived, the powder was ready. It carried no visible history, no warning signs encoded in custom. It was clean, white, modern. It fit neatly into drawers and medical discourse alike. Its distant origins lent it mystique without accountability. The leaf from distant mountains had been remade into something else entirely, a substance designed to serve a society unwilling to slow down, and perfectly suited to a season that demanded endurance while pretending it was joy. The powder did not enter Victorian life quietly. It arrived accompanied by words. Medical journals brimmed with optimism. Case reports spoke in confident tones of renewed vigor, sharpened intellect, and restored morale. Cocaine was discussed not as experiment, but as discovery, a substance that seemed to answer questions medicine had long struggled to resolve. Fatigue, melancholy, nervous exhaustion, all appeared suddenly manageable. The profession leaned forward, eager to believe. Victorian medicine prized intervention. To act was to progress. To observe without altering was to stagnate. Cocaine offered action in its purest form, immediate, measurable, dramatic. Physicians recorded its effects with fascination. Pulse quickened, spirits lifted, appetite diminished. Patients reported clarity, confidence, a sense of capability returning where it had quietly eroded. The enthusiasm was not reckless in its own time. It was structured, referenced, debated within respectable forums. Doctors cited one another. Journals compared findings. The substance was weighed, dissolved, administered with apparent precision. Language mattered. Cocaine was framed as therapeutic, not indulgent. Its effects were described clinically, stripped of moral concern. Importantly, early reports focused on function, not consequence. A substance that restored energy was praised, one that lifted mood was celebrated. Long-term reliance was rarely considered, not from negligence, but from assumption. Medicine operated on the belief that treatment corrected imbalance, after which normality resumed. The idea that correction itself might create dependency lay beyond prevailing frameworks. Christmas fatigue fit neatly into this narrative. Seasonal exhaustion was understood as temporary depletion, not systemic strain. A stimulant that restored vitality seemed appropriate, even elegant. Physicians did not question why so many required assistance at the same time. They addressed the symptom presented, not the environment producing it. Medical authority extended beyond the clinic. Journals influenced public perception. Articles were summarized in newspapers. Ideas filtered outward into polite conversation. Cocaine became associated with modernity, intellect, and scientific advancement. Its use signaled engagement with progress, not surrender to vice. Doctors, many of them embedded within the same social circuits as their patients, felt the pressure of Christmas themselves. They understood the demands intimately. This familiarity softened skepticism. A remedy that worked for their patients often worked for them as well. Shared experience reinforced belief. Prescriptions followed, not always written, sometimes implied. Advice offered casually, couched in reassurance. The substance was presented as safe when used correctly, a phrase heavy with implication and light on definition. Correctness was assumed to be intuitive, guided by professional oversight. The journals rarely spoke of excess. When adverse reactions occurred, they were attributed to individual sensitivity rather than inherent risk. The prevailing assumption held firm. Substances, properly applied, improved the body. Failures were anomalies, not warnings. This confidence filtered downward. Patients trusted their doctors. Doctors trusted their literature. Literature trusted progress. Cocaine sat comfortably within this chain of belief, buoyed by authority at every level. Its adoption did not feel radical. It felt inevitable. Christmas, once again, amplified acceptance. The season offered endless opportunities to witness success. Patients returned, reporting improved endurance, smoother social interactions, diminished fatigue. These testimonials reinforced enthusiasm. The powder appeared to fulfill its promise. Yet within the language of praise lay a subtle erasure. The journals rarely described the moments when effects wore off. They did not dwell on the body's return to exhaustion, often sharper than before. The focus remained on intervention, not aftermath. Doctors believed they were witnessing advancement. Journals reflected confidence. Together, they built a narrative in which cocaine was not merely useful, but necessary, a logical extension of modern medicine addressing modern demands. In this atmosphere of approval, doubt struggled to find footing. The powder moved from novelty to norm, carried forward by authority that rarely paused to ask whether the problem lay not in the patient, but in the season that demanded so much of them in the first place. Victorian society was no stranger to stimulants, but it distrusted their excess. Alcohol had long lubricated social life, yet it carried danger. A flushed face, a loosened tongue, an unguarded remark. These were visible failures, difficult to retract once exposed under gaslight. Drunkenness undermined the very composure respectability demanded. It dulled judgment when judgment was required most. At Christmas, when scrutiny intensified, alcohol became a risk to be managed carefully. Cocaine offered something different. It did not blur the edges of the mind, it sharpened them. It did not invite sloppiness, it promised control. This distinction mattered deeply in a culture that equated self-mastery with moral worth. The ideal stimulant was one that worked invisibly, enhancing performance without announcing itself. Cocaine fit this ideal precisely. Where alcohol softened, cocaine clarified. Speech quickened rather than slurred. Attention heightened rather than wandered. Confidence rose without collapsing into bravado. A man could drink wine at dinner, but cocaine ensured he remained articulate. A woman could endure hours of hosting without appearing fatigued or flushed. The substance preserved dignity, even as it altered physiology. This made cocaine socially superior. Victorian culture valued moderation not because it avoided harm, but because it preserved appearance. A substance that produced visible loss of control was suspect. One that concealed its influence while delivering results was welcomed. Cocaine's effects aligned seamlessly with this ethic. It energized without spectacle. It stimulated without shame. Medical discourse reinforced this distinction. Doctors praised cocaine for its lack of intoxicating effects. It did not cloud reason. It did not provoke recklessness. In contrast to alcohol, which was increasingly associated with moral decline, cocaine was framed as precise and purposeful. It acted directly on the nerves, restoring function rather than disrupting it. Christmas sharpened this contrast. Social gatherings multiplied. Alcohol flowed freely, yet always under constraint. Hosts worried not only about guests' comfort, but about their conduct. Cocaine quietly mitigated these concerns. A discreet dose allowed individuals to remain lively without crossing the thin line into excess. The appeal extended beyond men. For women, alcohol carried even greater stigma. A woman who drank too freely risked judgment harsher than any directed at men. Cocaine offered energy without visible consumption. There was no glass to refill, no scent on the breath. Its use could remain entirely private, its effects public only in their success. This invisibility reinforced its acceptability. Cocaine did not disrupt rituals, it did not alter the choreography of Christmas. It enhanced participation while preserving the illusion that nothing artificial was required. The season's demands were met, and propriety remained intact. The contrast with opiates was equally important. Laudanum and similar substances softened pain but dulled presence. They encouraged withdrawal, quietude, passivity. Cocaine did the opposite. It propelled individuals outward, back into social space. It was not an escape from obligation, but a tool for fulfilling it. Victorians prized usefulness. A substance that rendered one more effective was inherently valuable. Cocaine restored the ability to engage, converse, decide, and endure. It aligned with the era's emphasis on productivity and performance. Drunkenness disrupted these qualities. Cocaine reinforced them. This framing allowed users to justify their reliance easily. They were not surrendering control. They were maintaining it. They were not indulging. They were optimizing. The language of efficiency replaced the language of pleasure. Christmas rewarded this logic generously. The individual who remained alert through long evenings, who spoke with ease late into the night, who showed no sign of weariness, was admired. The means by which this was achieved remained irrelevant so long as the outcome satisfied expectation. Energy without drunkenness became the ideal. Cocaine embodied it. In doing so, it secured its place within respectable life, not as a vice hidden in shadows, but as a quiet ally, enabling a society obsessed with control to push its members beyond natural limits while pretending nothing had changed at all. The promise was simple and therefore irresistible: wakefulness without cost. Victorian Christmas demanded a peculiar kind of alertness, not the sharp vigilance of danger, but the sustained attentiveness of performance. One had to listen closely, respond promptly, remember names, recall anecdotes, and maintain warmth without revealing effort. The mind could not drift, the eyes could not dull. Fatigue, though inevitable, had to be concealed beneath readiness. Cocaine appeared to answer this demand with unsettling precision. It arrived as a liquid, a powder, a solution bottled, measured, controllable. Alertness could now be summoned deliberately, like a service rendered on demand. A small amount before a visit, another before an evening gathering. The body, previously unreliable, seemed suddenly compliant. This was not the wakefulness of fear or urgency. It was smooth, focused, and efficient. Thoughts aligned more readily. Distraction receded. The sense of time compressed, allowing hours to pass without the heaviness that usually accompanied them. For those navigating the dense social calendar of Christmas, this effect felt miraculous. Importantly, this alertness did not feel artificial. It did not announce itself with jolt or shock. Instead, it presented as normality restored. The user felt not enhanced, but corrected, returned to the state they believed they should naturally possess. This perception mattered deeply. It preserved self-image. One was not cheating the season, one was meeting it properly. Medical language reinforced this illusion. Cocaine was described as stimulating the nerves, restoring balance, invigorating depleted systems. The language implied repair, not transformation. The bottle contained not excess, but remedy. Its use suggested prudence rather than indulgence. Christmas intensified reliance on this logic. The season allowed no margin for diminished capacity. Guests arrived regardless of sleep. Conversations unfolded regardless of mental strain. The body's need for rest conflicted directly with social obligation. Bottled alertness bridged this gap neatly, offering continuity where natural rhythm failed. The ritual of use became quietly integrated into preparation. Just as gloves were selected and hair arranged, the dose was considered. Timing mattered. Too early, and its effects might fade before the evening concluded. Too late, and sleep would be disrupted further. The substance demanded planning, which lent it legitimacy. It became part of the household's operational rhythm. Women used it to maintain poise through long afternoons of hosting, ensuring that smiles remained responsive and attention unwavering. Men used it to sustain engagement across successive gatherings, preserving sharpness in conversation and authority in presence. In both cases, the substance enabled adherence to expectation without visible compromise. Alertness, once a natural resource, had become a commodity. It could be stored, dispensed, adjusted. This shift aligned perfectly with Victorian faith in management and control. If time could be scheduled and labor organized, why not wakefulness? Yet this convenience carried an unspoken cost. Bottled alertness did not restore what was depleted, it borrowed against it. The body's signals were overridden, not resolved. Sleep debt accumulated. Nervous systems remained under strain. The sense of vitality was borrowed, not earned. But Christmas did not encourage reflection. The season rewarded immediacy. The party that succeeded mattered more than the morning after. The visit completed mattered more than the body's quiet protest. Bottled alertness delivered results quickly enough to silence doubt. As the holidays progressed, reliance deepened subtly. What began as occasional assistance became expectation. The body learned that fatigue would not halt proceedings. Chemistry would intervene. The line between preparation and dependence blurred without ceremony. By the time decorations were taken down and routines resumed, the bottle remained. Alertness, once summoned for Christmas, was now available for everyday demands. The season had served its purpose, not only celebrating tradition, but normalizing a new relationship between the body and its limits. Wakefulness had been captured, contained, and consumed, and the holidays, in their relentless insistence on presence, had taught an entire class of people that exhaustion need not be acknowledged, only managed discreetly from a bottle kept close at hand. The substance did not arrive through back doors or shadowed alleys. It came through the front. In Victorian cities, the chemist's shop occupied a place of quiet authority. Its windows were orderly, its shelves precise, its counters clean. Glass bottles stood labeled in careful script, their contents rendered respectable by taxonomy alone. These were not spaces of indulgence, but of trust, places where the body's uncertainties could be corrected without embarrassment. Cocaine took its place here, naturally. Polite neighborhoods supported polite remedies. The chemist was not merely a vendor, but a guardian of propriety. He stood between the public and the rawness of illness, translating discomfort into manageable form. A purchase made across his counter did not carry shame. It carried reassurance. One did not seek cocaine. One was advised, supplied, and instructed. The geography mattered. These shops were situated along well-kept streets, within walking distance of drawing rooms and churches. Their proximity lent legitimacy. A remedy obtained so openly, so calmly, could not be dangerous. It was woven into daily life with the same discretion as stationery or gloves. Conversations within these spaces were muted and precise. Requests were framed carefully: fatigue, nervousness, difficulty concentrating. The chemist responded with professional calm. Dosage was discussed. Instructions offered. The exchange was clinical, not confessional. There was no need to explain oneself fully. The culture assumed the need. Christmas increased foot traffic. The season brought with it a predictable wave of exhaustion, and chemists were prepared. They stocked accordingly. Bottles were replenished, solutions prepared. The holiday rush was understood not as crisis, but as routine. The season demanded stamina. Chemistry supplied it. Importantly, the chemist's role shielded the user from self-doubt. Responsibility was shared. The substance was not taken impulsively. It was obtained through a ritual of approval. This structure reassured both parties. The chemist acted within professional bounds. The customer remained respectable. Women found particular comfort here. A discreet visit avoided scrutiny. There was no need to explain absence from social duties. The solution could be obtained quickly and returned home unseen. Men, too, appreciated the efficiency. A brief stop between engagements, a purchase made without fuss, and the day could continue uninterrupted. The shops themselves reinforced restraint. They were spaces of measurement, not excess. Scales calibrated, droppers counted. The atmosphere discouraged indulgence, even as it facilitated reliance. Cocaine, presented this way, appeared controllable. It was not wild, it was managed. This presentation shaped behavior profoundly. Substances acquired in chaos invite chaos. Substances acquired in order invite repetition. The chemist's shop taught users to think of cocaine not as escape, but as maintenance. Like ink or lamp oil, it was something one kept on hand to ensure smooth operation. Over time, this normalization deepened. Regular customers returned. Familiarity grew. The chemist recognized patterns but did not name them. His role was not to interrogate need, but to supply appropriately. The culture did not reward hesitation. It rewarded efficiency. Christmas passed, but the route remained. The shop did not close with the season. Its shelves stayed stocked. What had been acquired for endurance became available for convenience. The threshold had been crossed quietly, without scandal. In polite neighborhoods, danger rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived neatly labeled, politely dispensed, and carefully measured. The chemist's shop offered more than remedy. It offered absolution. And within its calm walls, the line between care and dependence thinned not through recklessness, but through routine. Cocaine did not infiltrate respectability by force. It was invited in, wrapped in professionalism, and placed carefully among other trusted solutions. The door closed behind it gently, and the neighborhood, reassured by appearances, never thought to ask what would happen once the bottles began to empty more quickly than before. Shame requires witnesses. Cocaine learned how to avoid them. Unlike substances that announce themselves through smell, ritual, or spectacle, this powder asked for nothing visible. There was no smoke curling from pipes, no clink of glasses emptied too quickly, no heavy scent lingering in the air. Its use could be completed in moments behind a closed door, without leaving a trace that others might question. This discretion was not accidental. It was central to the substance's success. Victorian society was governed less by law than by observation. What could be seen could be judged. What remained invisible often passed without comment. Cocaine occupied this invisible space perfectly. It altered the body while preserving appearances, allowing users to move through social environments unchanged except in effectiveness. The absence of visible markers shielded it from moral scrutiny. This mattered profoundly for those whose reputations depended on restraint. A woman could not afford public indulgence. A man could not risk visible loss of control. Cocaine offered stimulation without spectacle. Its effects unfolded internally, manifesting only as improved performance. One appeared more attentive, more lively, more capable, never compromised. The ritual of use was deliberately unceremonious. There were no shared moments, no communal acknowledgement. Unlike drinking, which occurred publicly and reinforced bonds through shared consumption, cocaine was solitary. Its privacy protected the user from association. There were no accomplices, no observers, no witnesses to complicate the narrative of self-control. Medical framing reinforced this lack of shame. Cocaine was not taken for pleasure, but for function. Its purpose was correction, not escape. This distinction mattered deeply in a culture that condemned indulgence but praised discipline. To correct a failing was admirable. To seek pleasure was suspect. Cocaine's effects could be interpreted as evidence of responsibility rather than weakness. Christmas provided ideal conditions for this interpretation. The season offered endless justification. Fatigue was expected. Assistance was reasonable. A discreet measure taken to ensure one met obligations could be framed as diligence. Shame had no foothold where necessity could be claimed so easily. The powder's lack of sensory drama further protected it. There was no warmth spreading through the limbs, no immediate haze, no obvious pleasure to betray intent. The user felt clearer, steadier, more focused states that aligned with cultural ideals. These effects could be embraced without guilt. They felt earned, not stolen. This absence of shame encouraged repetition. Without social consequence, the only limits were personal, and those limits had already been weakened by expectation. The body's resistance had been reinterpreted as malfunction. Chemistry corrected it. Each successful correction reinforced the belief that no transgression had occurred. Over time, this logic extended beyond Christmas. What was acceptable during the season remained acceptable afterward. The powder stayed in its place, ready to be used when demands resurfaced. Its invisibility allowed it to persist unnoticed, woven into routines without announcement. Even when doubts surfaced, they lacked language. There were no obvious signs to provoke concern, no public failures, no dramatic scenes. The substance did not announce itself as dangerous. It simply worked until it required more to achieve the same effect, a detail easily attributed to increasing demands rather than growing reliance. Shame thrives on contrast between what is shown and what is hidden. Cocaine erased that contrast by leaving nothing to see. Its use produced only success, at least initially. The absence of visible cost delayed reckoning. The culture, reassured by appearances, saw no reason to intervene. Powder without shame moved freely through respectable life. It passed from drawer to pocket, from solution to routine, without disturbing the surface of propriety. And because nothing seemed wrong, no one asked whether something had quietly changed beneath the calm exterior, whether the absence of shame itself was the most dangerous feature of all. Victorian society rarely spoke of desire. It spoke instead of betterment. Every aspect of life was framed through progress: cleaner streets, faster machines, sharper minds, stronger bodies. Improvement was not merely encouraged, it was expected. To remain unchanged was to fall behind. Within this vocabulary, cocaine found its most persuasive disguise. It was not indulgence, it was advancement. The language mattered, words shaped morality. A substance taken for pleasure invited suspicion. A substance taken for improvement invited praise. Cocaine entered polite conversation not as a thrill, but as a refinement, something that enhanced what was already present rather than replacing it. One did not become someone else under its influence. One became more oneself, sharpened and corrected. Doctors reinforced this framing with enthusiasm. They spoke of efficiency, stimulation, and restoration. Cocaine did not intoxicate, it optimized. It did not weaken character, it fortified it. These distinctions were subtle but powerful. They allowed individuals to incorporate the substance into their lives without feeling compromised. Improvement carried no shame. Christmas provided the perfect proving ground for this logic. The season exposed deficiencies ruthlessly. Fatigue dulled conversation. Irritability strained courtesy. Lapses in attention signaled decline. Cocaine promised correction without confession. It improved performance without admitting weakness. One did not need to say, "I am exhausted." One simply became capable again. This was the great appeal. Improvement required no vulnerability. The substance aligned seamlessly with Victorian ideals of self-mastery. To recognize a flaw and correct it was considered virtuous. Cocaine framed fatigue and melancholy as technical problems rather than human limits. The solution was therefore technical as well. Adjust the chemistry and the system functioned again. This logic extended beyond medicine into personal identity. A person who relied on cocaine did not see themselves as dependent. They saw themselves as disciplined, someone who took steps to remain effective. The substance became a tool, like spectacles for weak eyesight or tonics for poor digestion. Its use was not an admission of failure, but evidence of responsibility. The language of improvement also softened concern. When effects wore off, the response was not alarm but recalibration. Perhaps the dose had been insufficient. Perhaps the demands had increased. The solution was adjustment, not abstention. Improvement was ongoing, never complete. There was always another refinement to be made. Victorian culture prized measurable progress. Cocaine delivered results that could be observed immediately. Energy increased, focus sharpened, mood lifted. These outcomes reinforced belief. Improvement, once tasted, became difficult to relinquish. The contrast between chemically assisted performance and natural limitation grew increasingly stark. This comparison altered perception subtly but decisively. The unassisted body began to feel inadequate. Fatigue no longer appeared as a signal to rest, but as a flaw to be corrected. Melancholy no longer suggested reflection or withdrawal, but inefficiency. The language of improvement left no room for acceptance of limits. Christmas magnified this effect. Each successful gathering achieved through chemical aid confirmed the narrative. The season was survived not through rest or reprieve, but through optimization. The body learned that improvement was expected, even under strain. Over time, the vocabulary hardened. Words like need and help faded. They were replaced by support, enhancement, maintenance. The substance became part of upkeep, a means of staying aligned with the pace of modern life. To forego, it began to feel like negligence. The danger lay not in excess, but in belief. When improvement becomes moral obligation, any tool that delivers it appears justified. Cocaine thrived in this space, sheltered by language that transformed reliance into virtue. The Victorians did not think they were losing control. They believed they were perfecting it. And in that belief, the line between aid and dependence dissolved quietly, not through recklessness, but through the relentless pursuit of becoming better than the body, left to itself, could ever be. By December, exhaustion had acquired a calendar. Doctors recognized the pattern, even if they refused to name its cause. Patients arrived with familiar complaints as the season approached: racing thoughts, sleepless nights, trembling hands, an unshakable sense of depletion that no amount of polite endurance could conceal. Christmas brought them reliably, like frost or fog. The consultations followed a rhythm as old as the holiday itself. The language used was careful. No one spoke of overwork imposed by custom. No one questioned why the same symptoms appeared each year at the same time. Instead, fatigue was diagnosed as seasonal nervous strain, a temporary imbalance brought on by heightened activity and emotional exertion. The implication was reassuring. This was not failure. It was chemistry, slightly out of alignment. And chemistry, of course, could be corrected. Christmas prescriptions were rarely dramatic. They did not carry the weight of emergency or illness. They were offered calmly, almost casually, as practical solutions to predictable discomfort, a measured stimulant to restore vitality, a tonic to sharpen attention, something to carry one through the demands of the season without incident. Cocaine fit neatly into this role. It was prescribed not as cure, but as support, a way to stabilize the nervous system under temporary strain. The word temporary mattered. It implied an end point. One would use the substance during the season and set it aside afterward, just as decorations were packed away once Twelfth Night passed. Doctors believed this sincerely. Their training encouraged intervention without introspection. The patient presented a symptom. The physician addressed it. Christmas was not interrogated as a structure that produced harm. It was accepted as inevitable. Medicine's role was to make the individual compatible with it. Prescriptions reflected this philosophy. Doses were modest, instructions precise. The substance was framed as something to be used responsibly, sparingly, and only when necessary. Yet, necessity was defined by social obligation rather than physical need. If one had to host, attend, or perform, then assistance was justified. Patients accepted these prescriptions gratefully. The authority of medicine transformed private struggle into sanctioned action. Taking cocaine no longer felt like a personal decision. It was compliance with professional advice. Responsibility shifted outward. If the substance was recommended, its use could not be improper. Christmas reinforced this trust. The immediate relief was undeniable. Fatigue lifted quickly. The mind cleared. Social engagements became manageable again. The patient returned to the doctor not with complaints, but with success. The remedy appeared to work exactly as intended. What went unrecorded were the moments between doses, the creeping return of exhaustion, sometimes sharper than before. These fluctuations were interpreted as evidence that the condition persisted, not that the treatment created new dependency. The solution, logically, was continuation. The season did not allow for abstention. Obligations did not pause because one felt depleted. Each event demanded full presence. Prescriptions bridged the gap between what was required and what the body could provide naturally. In doing so, they subtly redefined normality. A body that required assistance to meet Christmas expectations was no longer seen as overburdened, but as correctly treated. Women received these prescriptions with particular frequency. Their complaints were often framed as nervous sensitivity exacerbated by holiday duties. Men received them under the banner of mental fatigue or professional strain. The substance crossed gender boundaries smoothly, adapting its justification to fit expectation. As the season progressed, the prescription lost its novelty. It became part of routine, something one took without deliberation, like preparing for guests or arranging schedules. The distinction between treatment and habit blurred quietly, without alarm. When Christmas ended, many intended to stop. Some did. Others discovered that the relief had become necessary beyond the holiday. The prescriptions, initially framed as seasonal aids, had introduced a new baseline of functioning. Doctors rarely followed up. The crisis had passed. The patient appeared well. The season moved on. Yet the pattern remained, ready to repeat itself the following year. Christmas prescriptions had solved an immediate problem while seeding a quieter one. They had taught the body that endurance could be manufactured, that fatigue could be silenced rather than honored. And in doing so, they ensured that when the next December arrived, the drawer would already be stocked, waiting for the season to demand once again what nature alone could no longer supply. Victorian medicine did not merely seek to cure illness. It sought to regulate feeling. Emotion, in this era, was increasingly treated as a physiological phenomenon, something generated by nerves, blood, and balance, rather than circumstance or meaning. Cheerfulness was not simply a state of mind. It was evidence that the body was functioning correctly. If joy faltered, the assumption was not that life had become unbearable, but that the system required adjustment. Christmas intensified this belief. The season demanded visible happiness. Its rituals insisted upon warmth, generosity, and goodwill, regardless of private reality. When individuals failed to meet this expectation, medicine offered explanation and remedy. Low spirits were reframed as nervous depletion. Gloom became imbalance. The solution was intervention, not inquiry. Doctors spoke with growing confidence about the body's capacity to produce emotion chemically. Stimulants could lift spirits. Sedatives could calm agitation. Mood, once considered moral or spiritual, was increasingly discussed in mechanical terms. Cocaine occupied a privileged position within this framework. It did not suppress feeling. It amplified it, or at least the appearance of it. Patients reported a sense of lightness after use. Conversation felt easier. Laughter came more readily. The heaviness that accompanied fatigue and melancholy receded. These effects were interpreted not as artificial elevation, but as the restoration of normal emotional function. Cheerfulness, it seemed, could be summoned deliberately. This belief was profoundly reassuring. It suggested that happiness was not fragile or mysterious. It could be manufactured reliably, like heat or light. The uncertainty of emotion gave way to the predictability of chemistry. For a society uncomfortable with introspection, this was an attractive proposition. Christmas provided constant validation. Gatherings unfolded smoothly. Hosts appeared warm and engaged. Guests responded with enthusiasm. The social machine functioned as intended. The chemical contribution remained invisible, masked by success. The science of cheerfulness appeared proven by outcome alone. Importantly, this cheerfulness did not feel forced. Users did not experience themselves as acting falsely. They felt genuinely capable, genuinely engaged. The substance did not create joy from nothing. It removed barriers to its expression. At least, that was how it seemed. Fatigue and melancholy were framed as obstructions, not signals. Remove them, and cheerfulness would naturally emerge. This interpretation absolved the season of responsibility. Christmas was not too demanding. Modern life was not excessive. The individual body had merely required assistance. Medicine supplied it. Harmony was restored. Yet beneath this logic lay a dangerous assumption that cheerfulness was always appropriate, that sadness indicated malfunction rather than response, that emotional discomfort should be eliminated rather than understood. Cocaine reinforced this assumption by delivering results quickly and convincingly. The body learned a new lesson. When joy faded, something was wrong. When energy dipped, correction was required. Emotional fluctuation lost its legitimacy. The range of acceptable feeling narrowed, bounded by expectation and reinforced by chemistry. Doctors, observing success, grew bolder. They spoke of mood regulation with increasing authority. Cocaine became part of a broader effort to engineer emotional consistency. The messy variability of human feeling was treated as inefficiency. Christmas, with its rigid emotional script, provided the ideal environment for this experiment. Those who resisted this framing found themselves isolated. A person who remained subdued despite intervention was seen as uncooperative or constitutionally flawed. The substance worked for most. Failure to respond marked one as abnormal. Thus, cheerfulness became less a gift and more an obligation. It was no longer something that arose organically, but something that could be demanded and produced. The science appeared sound. The results were visible. Doubt had little room to grow. And yet, beneath the surface, something subtle shifted. Joy achieved through intervention began to feel less satisfying once it wore off. The contrast between chemically assisted cheer and unassisted fatigue sharpened. Natural emotion seemed insufficient, dulled by comparison. The science of cheerfulness had achieved its goal. Emotion was now manageable. but in making joy predictable, it also made it dependent. Christmas glowed brighter than ever, sustained not by rest or reprieve, but by a belief that happiness, properly administered, could be guaranteed. The cost of this belief would not be measured immediately. It would emerge slowly, in the quiet spaces where cheerfulness could no longer be summoned on command, and the body began to question whether joy manufactured so precisely had ever truly belonged to it at all. Control was the Victorian ideal, and cocaine seemed to offer it in its purest form. This was not the surrender associated with intoxication, nor the drifting softness of sedation. Cocaine did not invite chaos. It promised mastery. The user did not feel overtaken by the substance, but elevated above fatigue, sharpened beyond distraction. The body, once unreliable, appeared suddenly obedient again. This sensation of command was intoxicating in itself. Victorian culture revered self-governance. To regulate one's impulses, emotions, and energy was considered a mark of refinement. Christmas tested this virtue relentlessly. The season demanded stamina without irritation, generosity without depletion, cheerfulness without complaint. Cocaine appeared to make this possible. It restored the feeling that one remained in charge, not merely coping, but directing. This perception mattered more than reality. The effects of the substance reinforced the belief that control had been regained. Thoughts aligned neatly. Speech flowed with confidence. Physical discomfort faded into the background. The user felt capable, even composed. There was no obvious sign of interference. The body did what it was told. The mind followed willingly. Unlike substances that overwhelmed sensation, cocaine worked subtly. It did not impose pleasure. It removed resistance. The user interpreted this as strength returning, not artificial influence. The distinction was critical. One does not resent assistance that masquerades as one's own capacity. Christmas gatherings provided constant confirmation. The individual who might otherwise have faltered remained sharp through long evenings. The hostess who should have collapsed under strain instead managed each detail flawlessly. The gentleman who ought to have tired continued speaking with precision late into the night. Each success reinforced the belief that control had been restored legitimately. This illusion was comforting. It allowed individuals to believe that they had not exceeded their limits, they had merely managed them intelligently. Cocaine was framed not as a crutch, but as a tool, and tools, after all, extended human capability. They did not diminish it. Medical language strengthened this belief. Doctors spoke of regulation, balance, correction. Cocaine was presented as a means of restoring proper function, not overriding it. The body was not being pushed beyond itself. It was being returned to its optimal state. This narrative preserved dignity and justified continued use. Yet the sense of control was fragile, dependent on repetition. When the effects faded, fatigue returned, sometimes more sharply than before. The body, having been overridden, demanded acknowledgement. Instead, the response was often renewed intervention. The illusion of control required maintenance. This cycle deepened quietly. Each use confirmed the belief that control was possible through chemistry. Each lapse reinforced the need to intervene again. The user remained convinced that they were choosing assistance freely, unaware that the parameters of choice were narrowing. Christmas accelerated this pattern. The season allowed no space for experimentation or abstention. There was no socially acceptable moment to test whether control could be sustained without aid. Obligations arrived regardless. The illusion, once established, could not be challenged without risk. The danger lay not in excess, but in certainty. The belief that one was in control discouraged caution. The substance did not appear to dictate behavior, it appeared to obey it. This perception masked the subtle shift taking place from control over use to reliance on effect. Victorian society rewarded the appearance of mastery above all else. Those who maintained composure were praised. Those who faltered were quietly dismissed. Cocaine allowed individuals to remain on the favored side of this divide. The cost was deferred, hidden beneath success. By the time doubt emerged, it was easily dismissed. The problem, if any, lay not with the substance, but with circumstance. Demands had increased, stress had grown. The solution, logically, was more careful management, not abandonment. Thus the illusion held. Control seemed intact even as dependence formed beneath it. The body's autonomy eroded, while the mind clung to the belief that it remained sovereign. Christmas passed, leaving behind satisfaction and fatigue intertwined. The season had been mastered, or so it seemed. Yet the true victory belonged to the substance that had learned how to present obedience as empowerment, convincing an entire class of people that surrender, when sufficiently refined, could feel exactly like control. The objects that carried cocaine were chosen carefully. They were never crude. Victorian high society understood the power of presentation. What was hidden mattered as much as what was displayed, and how something was concealed often determined whether it would be questioned at all. Cocaine did not travel in bottles marked with warning or stigma. It rested inside objects already associated with refinement: snuff boxes, silk-lined cases, lacquered tins, glass vials tucked among gloves and handkerchiefs. These containers were familiar. They belonged to the grammar of polite life. Snuff boxes had long been part of gentlemanly ritual, passed casually during conversation, their contents assumed to be harmless, even elegant. Silk-lined drawers suggested care, not secrecy. A substance stored beside calling cards and jewelry borrowed the respectability of its surroundings. The powder was not framed as intrusion. It appeared to belong. This mattered deeply. Victorian culture trusted objects that looked right. A thing wrapped in velvet, housed in carved wood, or presented with symmetry did not invite suspicion. Danger, in the popular imagination, arrived roughly in dark bottles, coarse packaging, disordered spaces. Cocaine learned how to disguise itself by adopting the aesthetics of safety. Women kept it near mirrors, among hairpins and scent bottles. Men carried it discreetly, alongside tobacco or personal effects. Its proximity to ordinary rituals normalized its presence. The powder did not interrupt routine, it blended into it. The act of access was similarly refined. There was no dramatic preparation, no ceremony that might provoke reflection. A drawer opened, a box lifted, a measured amount taken with practiced discretion. The motion was smooth, efficient, unremarkable. This lack of drama prevented doubt from forming. Nothing about the act suggested danger. Christmas heightened the significance of these objects. The season required constant readiness, and readiness depended on access. The snuff box in a pocket allowed correction without delay. The silk-lined drawer offered restoration between visits. These objects became quiet anchors, ensuring the body could be adjusted as needed. Importantly, their presence was rarely discussed. They did not invite conversation. Their silence protected them. To speak of them would have been to risk naming reliance. It was safer to let the objects remain mute, performing their function without acknowledgement. This silence extended to observation. Servants noticed the boxes and cases but did not comment. Their training emphasized discretion. They learned to recognize what was not to be mentioned. The presence of such objects was absorbed into the household's unspoken order. The refinement of these containers reinforced the illusion that the substance itself was refined. Cocaine, when presented so delicately, did not appear capable of harm. It seemed controlled, civilized, domesticated. Its sharpness was softened by silk and polish, its potency hidden beneath beauty. Over time, the objects acquired emotional weight. They became associated with relief, with restored capability, with survival of demanding days. The snuff box was no longer merely an accessory. It was assurance. The drawer was no longer storage. It was refuge. This attachment went largely unexamined. Victorian culture encouraged loyalty to objects that served well. A tool that delivered consistent benefit was trusted. The fact that the benefit masked exhaustion rather than resolving it remained unspoken. As the powder's role expanded beyond Christmas into everyday life, the objects followed. They were kept close, maintained carefully, replenished without hesitation. Their presence became habitual, their absence unsettling. What had begun as discreet storage evolved into quiet dependence, mediated through beautiful things. The danger lay not only in the substance, but in the way it was nestled into elegance, protected by silk and routine. Cocaine did not announce itself as threat. It waited patiently inside familiar forms, hidden among objects of trust, until reliance felt indistinguishable from preparedness. In a culture that believed refinement equaled safety, the snuff box and the silk-lined drawer proved to be the perfect camouflage, turning necessity into ornament and dependence into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like taste. In the drawing rooms of Victorian high society, smiles were currency. They measured grace, charm, and worth. A woman who could maintain one through long hours of hosting, conversation, and observation commanded admiration. One who faltered risked judgment, whispered speculation, and the quiet assessment of inadequacy. Christmas demanded this smile more than any other season, pressing it from the lips of women who had already exhausted every reserve of patience and poise. Some smiles were born of effort alone, others were forged with assistance. Cocaine became a subtle ally. The powder did not force joy. It smoothed the edges of fatigue, allowing composure to persist when the body threatened to betray it. A hand that trembled slightly, a gaze that faltered under scrutiny, a laugh that came with effort rather than ease, all were rendered manageable once the substance had done its quiet work. The smile, previously strained, became genuine enough to satisfy observation. The effects were carefully calibrated. A dose too small left traces of weariness. A dose too large risked alertness without subtlety, energy without elegance. The goal was invisibility. A smile that appeared effortless, conversation that flowed without interruption, posture that betrayed no tension. The body was corrected, not displayed. The lady remained herself, only more capable. Christmas provided both incentive and validation. Long afternoons of hosting, evenings that stretched late into the night, social rituals that allowed no pause, all demanded composure. A woman's guests noticed only the surface. The powder ensured she could meet expectation without faltering. She could distribute charm, laughter, and attention evenly, appearing inexhaustible when the reality was otherwise. This effect extended beyond the superficial. Energy returned to the limbs, hands became steady, eyes regained their sparkle. The internal weight of fatigue lifted just enough for the exterior to function without complaint. Guests saw brightness and ease. They did not perceive the subtle engineering required to produce it. The invisible labor of the nervous system was concealed beneath the polished exterior. The moral framing mattered. Women did not describe their reliance as indulgence, but as preparation. The powder was a tool, like a well-chosen accessory or an arranged bouquet. It enabled participation in the social machinery, allowing the lady to fulfill her role with diligence rather than struggle. The apparent ease reinforced the belief that her refinement was innate, not chemically assisted. Yet beneath the surface, dependence quietly took root. Each successful smile reinforced the association between presence and powder. The body learned that endurance could be summoned, that composure could be restored artificially. Subtle reliance formed without declaration. The social calendar ensured regular exposure, and repetition masked awareness. The smile became symbolic. It was not merely expression. It was assurance that the household functioned, that appearances remained intact, that the season proceeded without interruption. It conveyed capability without revealing cost. Observers saw only harmony. They assumed competence. The powder remained invisible. This dynamic extended beyond Christmas. The lady who could finally smile learned that assistance could be summoned whenever expectation threatened to overwhelm natural capacity. The boundary between need and choice blurred. A season's requirement became a year-round standard. Reliance became routine, its presence unspoken, its effects unremarked. And yet, as guests departed and snow settled on the streets, the woman tucked her secret back into its discreet container. The smile lingered in memory, genuine enough for outsiders, carefully engineered enough for survival. Within the drawing room, the illusion of effortless charm remained perfect. Behind the veil of composure, the quiet aid of chemistry ensured that the lady could continue to meet the unrelenting demands of a society that expected brilliance without pause, and for which rest was never an option. Christmas demanded attention that the human body was never meant to sustain. The hostess, custodian of hearth and ceremony, bore the weight of expectation heavier than most. From morning until night, she navigated schedules, overseen by invisible judges in the form of family, acquaintances, and society at large. Every detail, from the placement of napkins to the timing of carol singing, was scrutinized. There was no pause, no reprieve, no natural rest permitted. Sleep became a casualty of decorum. Her day began before the household stirred. Firewood arranged, hearths lit, kitchens supervised, each task performed with meticulous care. The arrival of guests required composure, charm, and an appearance of boundless energy. A smile alone was insufficient. Attentiveness was demanded. Conversations had to flow seamlessly, questions answered, advice given, and subtle judgments administered without hesitation. Every action was observed, measured, and silently assessed. Any faltering suggested weakness. The human body, however, is finite. Hours of standing, walking, bending, and orchestrating accumulated. Muscles ached, eyes burned. The nervous system, pushed beyond natural limits, signaled rebellion. Fatigue pressed upon her consciousness with insistent weight, but acknowledgement was impossible. Social survival required concealment. The hostess who allowed exhaustion to show risked whispers, suspicion, and diminished status. It was here that the powder offered relief. Cocaine entered this delicate equilibrium as an invisible hand, steadying nerves, brightening focus, and restoring vitality without announcing itself. A discreet measure taken before the first call of the day, or during a brief interlude, allowed the hostess to continue seamlessly. Hands became steady. Speech flowed effortlessly. Eyes regained brightness. The body seemed to obey, performing labor beyond its natural endurance. This intervention was framed as pragmatism rather than indulgence. A responsible woman did not overextend herself unnecessarily, but neither did she refuse tools that allowed her to meet expectation. The powder became a silent collaborator, extending capability without violating decorum. Its presence remained invisible, and its effects were interpreted as natural resilience rather than chemical assistance. Christmas, in this regard, created a reinforcing cycle. Each successful gathering strengthened reliance. The hostess observed her ability to maintain grace and composure, attributing her performance to skill and discipline rather than aid. Her confidence in the routine solidified. The powder, once exceptional, became routine. Its absence was felt as a limitation, though its presence remained unspoken. The social calendar permitted no lapse. One engagement bled into another. Luncheons followed dinners. Midnight services preceded early morning visits. Each demanded readiness and charm, yet offered no opportunity for restoration. The powder's discreet administration allowed her to meet these obligations without visible strain, preserving reputation and household authority simultaneously. Yet dependence formed quietly. Each instance reinforced the lesson. The body alone was insufficient. Natural limits could not guarantee adherence to social expectation. The substance became less of an aid and more of a scaffold. The hostess learned that endurance could be engineered, that fatigue could be circumvented, and that performance could be sustained without pause. As the day concluded, guests departed, the hearth dimmed, and streets fell silent beneath the snow. The hostess allowed herself the barest acknowledgement of relief. Only in solitude could the body rest, the nerves uncoil, and the mind release the tension accumulated over hours of invisible labor. Yet, even in these moments, the awareness of tomorrow's obligations lingered. The powder remained close at hand, tucked in drawers or hidden within silk, ready to restore composure when the season demanded its unwavering performance once again. Thus the hostess who never slept continued her endless vigil, balancing duty and expectation, sustained invisibly and upheld by a chemical ally whose presence was as quiet as it was indispensable. In Victorian society, speech was more than communication. It was proof of refinement, intelligence, and composure. Every word spoken, every pause observed, every inflection weighed against unspoken standards. Christmas heightened this scrutiny. Parlors were alive with guests whose attentions were selective, their judgments keen. To falter in conversation was to expose oneself, to reveal fatigue, hesitation, or emotional strain. A single misstep could undo hours of careful performance. The hostess and her company were acutely aware of this. Conversations flowed like choreographed dances, each topic navigated with precision, humor measured, wit deployed strategically, opinions offered in moderation. The dialogue was social currency. To squander it invited quiet censure. A misjudged joke, an ill-timed sigh, or a lapse in focus risked undermining the carefully maintained facade of competence. Fatigue threatened this performance first. As the hours wore on, minds blurred and timing faltered, memory weakened. Thoughts that had seemed quick in the morning slowed by evening. Speech, once effortless, required effort. The body betrayed the mind. A lady might pause too long before responding. A gentleman's wit might stumble mid-sentence. Such moments, however small, were magnified under observation. They signaled weakness. Cocaine intervened silently. Its effects were subtle, yet transformative. Attention sharpened. Words aligned with thought. Memory seemed clearer. The mind operated with the fluidity and precision demanded by society. Conversation, once perilous under the weight of fatigue, flowed smoothly again. Social danger, in the form of faltering expression or distracted engagement, was neutralized. This confidence was not merely performative. The substance acted directly on the nervous system, reducing tremor, easing tension, and amplifying mental clarity. The user experienced the sensation of control returning, not forced, not artificial, but regained. Timing improved. Humor reappeared. Engagement became effortless once more. Guests noticed only the result. A host or hostess entirely capable, entirely present, entirely composed. The effect reinforced belief. Confidence in conversation felt natural, despite its chemical origin. Success in dialogue validated both the performance and the means by which it was achieved. The powder's intervention became framed as rational, even prudent. One did not rely on it for pleasure. One relied on it to meet the demands of refinement. Christmas provided ample opportunity for practice and reinforcement. Multiple gatherings in a single day tested conversational stamina to its limits. Each event was an opportunity for performance. Each interaction, a trial of mental endurance. Cocaine allowed participants to traverse these engagements without revealing the internal struggle, preserving status and reputation while preventing fatigue from betraying competence. The rhythm of reliance deepened over time. The mind learned that lapses could be corrected chemically. Success became associated with intervention. Confidence, once effortless, became subtly contingent upon the substance. Each use strengthened this association. The social calendar, relentless in its demands, ensured that reliance was rehearsed, normalized, and expected. Yet this confidence was not without its illusion. The user believed mastery had been regained naturally, even as the body's underlying fatigue persisted. Mental clarity and social agility were restored, but at a deferred cost. The chemical scaffold allowed function to continue, while the nervous system absorbed strain invisibly. By the end of the evening, the smiles, the laughter, and the quick-witted exchanges were complete. Guests departed, impressed, oblivious to the quiet aid that had enabled such composure. The powder, tucked discreetly back into its container, had performed its task once again, sustaining the illusion that conversation and, by extension, social grace was always effortless, always natural, and always under the control of those who appeared so perfectly composed. Confidence in conversation, like the season itself, became a delicate construction, one maintained through preparation, performance, and a chemical ally whose presence was invisible, yet indispensable. In the parlors of Victorian high society, appetite was both a necessity and a liability. Food was abundant during Christmas, a display of wealth and hospitality, but the very abundance became a trial. Courses arrived in succession: soups, roasts, puddings, and sweets, each more elaborate than the last. A woman or gentleman was expected to partake with decorum, to demonstrate enjoyment without indulgence, to eat sufficiently without overstepping the bounds of propriety. Every bite was observed, every pause noted. Appetite was under scrutiny, and it carried moral weight. Fatigue made this task perilous. The body, already taxed by long hours of social expectation, did not demand sustenance purely for pleasure. It demanded fuel to maintain performance. Yet eating could slow, burden, and distract. Swollen stomachs, sluggish digestion, or lingering discomfort threatened composure. The host or hostess needed alertness above satiety. Guests' judgments were unforgiving. To falter under the weight of food was to signal weakness or carelessness. Cocaine offered a subtle solution. Its effects reduced the body's need for intake without diminishing capacity. Hunger, the natural warning that energy reserves were depleted, could be muted. A discreet dose quieted the digestive system's demands, allowing individuals to move through meal after meal with unaffected poise. The body felt light, the mind focused, the nerves steady. Social expectations were met without compromise. The suppression of appetite was framed not as indulgence or artifice, but as rational management. In a culture that prized self-discipline, choosing not to eat when the body suggested it was weakness could be perceived as folly. Choosing to silence that signal chemically, however, appeared as mastery. The individual demonstrated control over desire, endurance beyond nature, and foresight in anticipating the demands of the season. Hunger became negotiable. Fatigue became negotiable. Appetite itself could be orchestrated to match the calendar. This practice extended beyond necessity. Christmas meals were often extended events, stretching hours into the evening. The succession of courses left little time for digestion and even less for reflection. Individuals who relied solely on willpower risked distraction, irritability, or discomfort. Cocaine offered continuity, smoothing over the body's interruptions, permitting participation in ritual without compromise. The experience of abundance could be navigated as performance rather than indulgence. The effect on social perception was significant. Guests noted attentiveness, conversation flowing uninterrupted, gestures measured, responses timely. Appetite, or the lack thereof, went unnoticed. No one questioned the ability to endure the feasting. The chemical aid remained invisible, while its user moved gracefully through the performance. Control appeared innate. Mastery appeared natural. Yet the cost was latent. The suppression of appetite did not restore energy. It merely masked its depletion. The body's signals were deferred, postponed, muted. Temporary silence of hunger led inevitably to compensatory strain, fatigue hidden, nerves overstimulated, metabolism stressed. The immediate performance was preserved, but the underlying demand persisted, accumulating quietly. This subtle reliance became habitual. Individuals learned that endurance could be chemically supported, that appetite could be managed to meet social expectation, and that the seasonal ritual could be navigated without visible complaint. The powder did not remove challenge, it displaced it. The body was commanded to obey, and it did, quietly, invisibly, temporarily. By the conclusion of the holiday, courses completed and guests dispersed, the hostess or gentleman could reflect, if only briefly, upon the tension that had been managed and the signals that had been silenced. Appetite, once a natural guide, had been rendered negotiable, an inconvenience subdued in service of appearance. The body had performed admirably, yet owed a debt of restoration that would be demanded in quieter, private hours. In the parlors of Victorian society, eating had become not pleasure, but another duty, and chemistry had made its compliance possible. When the clock hands reached 12, the city's streets seemed to hold its breath. Outside, snow muffled carriage wheels and footsteps, and the glow of gaslight refracted through frosted panes, illuminating pale cheeks pressed against window panes. Inside the grand homes of Victorian high society, the season had reached its apex. Dinners had concluded, carols had been sung, and yet the evening's obligations were far from complete. Midnight demanded attention, a different kind of attention, one that required not only social grace, but vigilance of body and mind. Fatigue, at this hour, would have been expected in any natural rhythm. Muscles slackened, eyes grew heavy, hands trembled with the accumulation of long hours. The human body, unassisted, would have protested. But in these drawing rooms, protest was unacceptable. Guests continued to arrive or linger. Conversations, games, and performances stretched on. Every gesture, every word, every glance was observed, assessed, and weighed against the rigid standards of propriety. A lapse in stamina threatened more than comfort. It threatened reputation. It was here that chemical assistance found its perfect role. Cocaine, discreetly administered earlier in the evening or measured carefully just before the clock struck midnight, counteracted the body's rebellion. Limbs felt light. Thoughts returned to sharp alignment. The mind, previously dulled by hours of exertion, regained clarity. Attention, once threatened by strain, persisted without apparent effort. A host could move among guests, engaging, entertaining, guiding conversation, and participating in ritual without revealing the cumulative toll of the day. This effect was not merely functional, it was deceptive. The powder's influence maintained appearance while concealing cost. Laughter seemed spontaneous, speech unforced, gestures fluid. The body performed as though untouched by exhaustion. To observers, vitality appeared innate, composure effortless, engagement continuous. The guest saw only the surface, a hostess attentive, a gentleman articulate, a family capable of sustaining ceremony long after natural limits would have demanded pause. Victorian culture prized this appearance above all else. Effortlessness was proof of breeding, discipline, and refinement. What the body endured privately was irrelevant, or at least unspoken. Chemistry enabled compliance with these unyielding standards, offering a solution that aligned perfectly with societal expectations. It was not indulgence, but maintenance, not pleasure, but functionality. The ritual of midnight extended beyond conversation. Dancing, musical performances, the exchange of gifts, and attendance at late services all demanded sustained attention. Each activity reinforced the same imperative: to participate fully without betraying strain. The powder allowed the body to comply with precision. Hands remained steady over teacups and fiddles alike. Smiles did not falter, and steps remained measured, even as hours stretched into the early morning. Yet reliance deepened silently. Each successful night reinforced the association between chemical assistance and endurance. The body learned to expect intervention. Natural fatigue became intolerable. The mind, trained by repeated use, equated wakefulness with capability. Each hour of alertness achieved through powder-cemented habit, normalizing dependency under the guise of refinement. By the hour's end, guests departed, streets emptied, and hearths cooled. The powder, stored discreetly once more, waited for the next demand. Midnight had passed, yet its lesson endured. The body could be managed, controlled, and corrected. Fatigue, once inevitable, had been postponed. The season's expectations had been met without visible compromise. In this achievement, the true victory lay not in human endurance, but in the quiet efficacy of intervention. Midnight without fatigue became both a triumph and a promise that appearances could always be maintained, obligations always fulfilled, and the body always compelled to obey, as long as the powder remained within reach. In Victorian high society, the distinction between what was shown and what was hidden defined every interaction. Christmas magnified this dichotomy. Parlors were theatres, dinners were performances, and every smile or gesture carried weight. Appearances mattered more than reality. To falter publicly to betray fatigue, distraction, or discomfort was to invite judgment. The body, if left to its natural rhythms, often failed these expectations. It was here that private doses became essential, allowing public grace to flourish. The administration of cocaine was deliberate, quiet, and entirely personal. A small measure taken discreetly before guests arrived or during a brief interlude allowed the user to regain composure without attracting notice. No ceremony accompanied its use. No announcement marked its presence. The powder did not enter conversation or ritual. It remained invisible, its effects evident only in the restored poise of the host or hostess. It transformed weariness into energy, tremor into steadiness, distraction into focus, and fatigue into apparent vitality. Public grace depended upon this discretion. A hostess could move from room to room, attending to guests, managing servants, and directing ceremony with effortless charm. A gentleman could navigate successive calls and dinners, contributing wit and attentiveness without revealing the strain beneath. Each interaction, each gesture, each word flowed as if born from unflagging endurance. Observers noticed only refinement, never the artifice behind it. The effectiveness of this concealment relied on repetition and timing. Users learned the rhythms of their own bodies, when to take a dose, how much, and how to pace themselves through the evening's obligations. The goal was invisibility. Too much risked hyper-alertness or agitation. Too little risked tremor or distraction. Mastery over dosage became another form of skill, a subtle art that preserved the illusion of natural capability while masking the body's true state. This private intervention reinforced social ideals. Victorian society prized self-control, composure, and effortlessness. The powder enabled compliance with these standards without requiring rest or reduction in obligation. Public performance, once vulnerable to the body's limitations, was rendered reliable. Individuals could navigate long hours of hosting, conversation, and ceremony as if their endurance were innate rather than chemically assisted. Moreover, the private nature of the dose protected moral perception. The era equated visible indulgence with weakness or impropriety. Alcohol could intoxicate and opiates could sedate, leaving evidence of consumption and inviting scrutiny. Cocaine, by contrast, acted quietly, maintaining social functionality while leaving no trace of intervention. Dependence, if it arose, remained invisible. The user could meet the rigorous demands of society while preserving the appearance of propriety. Christmas, with its dense schedule of meals, calls, and festivities, provided constant opportunity to apply this practice. Each day's obligations demanded sustained attention. Each evening's performance tested composure. Private doses ensured that the body would not betray intent, that fatigue would not interrupt ceremony, and that the social narrative remained unbroken. What the eye observed was refinement and elegance. What the body experienced was labor, strain, and chemical mediation. Yet this convenience carried subtle consequences. The reliance on private doses trained the body to expect intervention, creating a quiet dependency beneath the polished exterior. The body's natural signals, hunger, tiredness, discomfort, were suppressed, ignored, or overridden. While public grace remained intact, private resilience became increasingly contingent upon chemical assistance. By the conclusion of the season, the pattern was clear. Social performance could be sustained indefinitely, but only with careful planning and discreet aid. Private doses enabled public grace, preserving the illusion that effortlessness was natural, while masking the true labor required. The powder became both tool and shield, mediating between the body's limitations and society's relentless expectations, ensuring that decorum remained unbroken, even as exhaustion pressed ever closer to the surface. In the parlors and drawing rooms of Victorian Christmas, the boundary between propriety and peril was subtle, almost imperceptible. Cocaine had entered lives as medicine, recommended by physicians, endorsed by journals, and administered with apparent reason. It was framed as a tool, a corrective, a means of restoring natural function. Yet, the very qualities that made it suitable as aid, its immediacy, its reliability, its invisibility, also rendered it dangerously seductive. The line between therapeutic use and habitual reliance was thinner than silk thread, and it frayed easily under the pressures of expectation. The season itself accelerated this transformation. Christmas demanded endurance beyond ordinary capacity. Long days of hosting, evening visits, rehearsed conversations, and extended dinners pressed the body relentlessly. The mind, previously capable of sustaining effort for hours, began to register strain. Fatigue crept into gestures, trembled in voices, and dulled the sparkle of attentive eyes. What had begun as a temporary intervention now became a predictable necessity. Victorian culture encouraged this normalization without recognizing its danger. Medicine was respected, authority was trusted. If a doctor suggested assistance, it could be accepted without hesitation, interpreted as prudence rather than indulgence. Repetition strengthened this belief. Each successful application reinforced the notion that the body required correction to meet the demands imposed by society. The pattern became routine before the mind noticed the dependency. This subtle encroachment was aided by discretion. Cocaine did not announce itself. It did not disturb appearances. Unlike alcohol, which could intoxicate visibly, or opiates, which softened the body into lethargy, cocaine maintained poise. Hands remained steady, speech flowed, posture persisted. Performance remained impeccable. Observers had no reason to question the means by which grace was sustained. The powder's very invisibility masked the formation of habit. The mental effect reinforced the cycle. Confidence, composure, and energy were restored seamlessly, creating the illusion that the body had always possessed sufficient stamina. Individuals came to attribute capability to self-discipline rather than chemical aid. Reliance was not acknowledged because it did not feel like surrender. It felt like competency maintained. The powder became a silent partner, its intervention internalized as natural fortitude. Christmas provided constant validation. Successive nights of hosting and entertaining confirmed that the pattern worked. Missed doses produced subtle, temporary failures, slight tremors in hands, momentary lapses in attention, fatigue creeping into conversation. Each instance reminded the individual that the powder was effective, reinforcing the desire to continue its use. Habit emerged imperceptibly, woven into routine under the guise of necessity. Even medical authority did not mitigate risk. Physicians framed use as precaution, not indulgence. Recommendations emphasized moderation, timing, and purpose, yet offered no guidance for cumulative reliance. The habit formed silently, nurtured by trust in expertise and by the demands of society itself. Dependency, when it grew, was invisible, its consequences deferred and internal. By the close of the holiday season, the powder was no longer merely a corrective. It had become integrated into the rhythm of life. Its use was rationalized as preparation, performance, or prudence. The thin line separating medicine from habit had been crossed without spectacle, and yet the body had been marked. Christmas had demonstrated that endurance could be chemically maintained, but at the quiet cost of autonomy. The season ended, carols faded, guests departed, yet the habit remained. Its formation was invisible, its effects subtle, its presence unacknowledged. The powder had secured a foothold, ensuring that future demands would be met not solely by self-discipline, but by chemical aid. The line between medicine and dependence had vanished, leaving only the appearance of control, the reality of reliance, and the silent, enduring shadow of necessity beneath polished surfaces. The human nervous system is a messenger. It signals exhaustion, alerts to strain, whispers, warnings when the body is taxed beyond its natural limits. In the parlors of Victorian Christmas, these signals were neither welcome nor tolerated. They were inconvenient, embarrassing, and contrary to the demands of propriety. A tremor, a fluttering heartbeat, a shiver of fatigue. Each was a small betrayal, evidence that the body was failing to meet the impossible expectations of society. And so, these messages were silenced. Cocaine accomplished this with terrifying precision. It calmed the restless nerves, smoothed the tremor of hands, steadied the pulse, and erased the sense of strain. The body's warnings, those subtle internal protests that had previously prevented collapse, were muffled, overridden by chemical insistence. The mind interpreted this absence as triumph. Composure returned. Energy felt renewed. Alertness seemed restored. The body no longer resisted, and the individual, trusting sensation, believed itself entirely capable once more. This suppression of natural signals was not accidental. Victorian culture demanded endurance, and any suggestion that the body might refuse its obligations was interpreted as weakness of character or constitution. Fatigue was personal failing, not structural truth. Nervous protest was moral deficiency. In such a world, a substance that quieted these messages was a discreet salvation. It preserved status, authority, and the appearance of virtue. The effect on behavior was profound. Individuals moved through social obligations as if nothing were amiss. Long dinners, successive visits, extended performances, all were completed without pause. Gestures were fluid, speech articulate, eyes bright, posture impeccable. The absence of warning allowed feats that the unassisted body could not sustain. Observation detected only success. No one noted the subtle coercion of the nervous system, the quiet override that made continued performance possible. Reliance grew imperceptibly. Each successful evening reinforced the belief that the body was naturally capable, that endurance was inherent, and that composure had always been within grasp. The chemical scaffold became normalized, internalized. Nervous signals that once demanded rest were no longer trusted. The individual learned to ignore or distrust them. Fatigue was denied before it could manifest visibly. Christmas amplified this effect. The season's schedule was relentless. Hours of hosting, conversation, and ceremonial observance left little opportunity for reflection. The nervous system's whispers were inconvenient interruptions. The powder silenced them efficiently. The illusion of natural stamina persisted, and social performance remained unimpeachable. Success was immediate and visible. Cost was deferred and invisible. Yet beneath this control lay a subtle danger. The body, denied its natural cues, continued to accumulate strain. Alertness and energy were chemically maintained, but exhaustion grew quietly. Dependency formed without announcement. The nervous system, deprived of its role as guide, could no longer prepare the mind or body for recovery. Signals that once prompted pause were absent. The individual was left vulnerable, reliant upon the very mechanism that had suppressed the warning. By the end of the season, the lesson was ingrained. The body could be persuaded to obey, to endure, to perform without complaint. Its protests could be silenced, its signals ignored. The powder had taught the mind to trust chemical authority over innate warning. Nervous messages no longer cautioned, tremors no longer spoke, fatigue no longer intruded, and the illusion of perfect composure reigned unchallenged. Sustained by quiet intervention beneath the unblinking gaze of Victorian expectation, in the parlors of Victorian high society, Christmas never truly concluded. Its obligations persisted in memory, in expectation, in preparation for the next gathering. The season's weight extended beyond candles, carols, and feasts. It embedded itself in posture, in gesture, in the quiet tension of the body that had been compelled to endure. The guests had departed, the streets lay silent beneath snow, yet the echoes of demand lingered, pressing invisibly upon nerves and muscles alike. For those who had relied on chemical assistance, the season's conclusion was deceptive. The powder, discreetly stored in drawers, snuff boxes, and silk-lined cases, remained close at hand. It was no longer merely a tool for surviving specific evenings, but a buffer against the cumulative demands of expectation, both real and imagined. Its presence promised continuity, a bridge between past obligations and those yet to arrive. The body, trained through repeated use, began to anticipate intervention. The mind, reassured by success, accepted it as natural. This continuity was subtle yet pervasive. The routines established during Christmas, precise doses timed to maintain alertness, composure, and energy, became templates for daily life. The evenings that had demanded flawless execution were now instructive, teaching the user that chemical support was both acceptable and efficacious. Each application reinforced the belief that endurance could be engineered, that limitation was negotiable, and that the human body could be coaxed to comply indefinitely. The social implications were profound. Guests who had observed the host or hostess saw only seamless charm, effortless grace, and unflagging attention. They assumed stamina was natural, composure inherent, and joy unassisted. The chemical scaffolding remained invisible, its operation entirely concealed. Reputation was preserved, appearances maintained, and expectation reinforced. Society rewarded those who appeared resilient, without questioning the methods by which that appearance had been achieved. Victorian ideals of self-discipline and mastery provided moral cover. Reliance on the powder was framed not as indulgence, but as prudence. The body's natural resistance was treated as anomaly, deficiency, or imbalance. Intervention was rationalized as care, preparation, or enhancement, all acceptable within the prevailing discourse. The substance did not compromise virtue, it reinforced it, enabling the individual to meet expectation without visible faltering. Yet beneath the surface, consequences accumulated quietly. Fatigue deferred, appetite suppressed, and nervous warnings silenced. The body absorbed strain invisibly. Dependency emerged subtly, internalized before awareness could form. What had begun as seasonal assistance became habitual reinforcement, a quiet mechanism ensuring that performance would continue without interruption. The illusion of effortless capability was maintained, even as reliance deepened. By the time decorations were stored and streets returned to winter silence, the powder's influence remained. Its presence suggested readiness, its absence potential failure. The body had learned to function only under its guidance. The mind had come to trust its intervention as natural. The season, in effect, had never ended. Its demands, encoded in habit, expectation, and chemical support, persisted beyond the calendar, stretching the lessons of December into every day that followed. Thus Christmas became both ritual and instruction, celebration and compulsion. The joy it celebrated was inseparable from endurance, the grace it demanded inseparable from chemical aid. The powder ensured that the body could continue to obey, the mind could continue to believe, and appearances could continue to impress. A season that never ended, existed not in time, but in expectation, in preparation, and in the quiet, invisible scaffolding that allowed society's demands to be met without compromise, a perpetual cycle of performance, dependency, and the delicate maintenance of the illusion of control. The first light of morning fell weakly through frost-veined windows, casting long shadows across polished floors and snow-dusted streets. Outside, the world was silent, hushed by ice and cold. Inside, however, the aftermath of Christmas lingered in subtle, invisible ways. The drawing rooms, once alive with conversation, laughter, and ceremony, now seemed heavy with exhaustion, though few would admit it. The human body, taxed beyond natural capacity, began to signal the cost of the season's relentless demands. The hostess rose first, as she had throughout the holiday, her movements deliberate, measured. Even now, in the solitude of early morning, the tension in her muscles lingered. Limbs ached, joints stiffened, and the body murmured its discontent in tremors too slight for others to notice, yet entirely perceptible to herself. Fatigue pressed against the chest and shoulders, a quiet weight accumulated over long nights of hosting, attending, and performing. The nerves, pushed to their limits, whispered caution too late for rest or reprieve. Men, too, bore the invisible toll. Gentlemen who had navigated successive dinners, calls, and social obligations now felt the residual strain. Speech, once effortless, seemed heavier. Eyes carried the memory of prolonged attention. Hands, steady through prolonged service, relaxed only slightly, revealing the subtle cost of uninterrupted performance. The body, which had so faithfully obeyed under chemical aid, now reminded its master of limits long denied. Cocaine, the invisible companion of the season, left traces in absence as well as presence. Its effects, once relied upon to sustain vigilance and composure, had faded with night's passage. The body's exhaustion, previously masked, returned suddenly and sharply. Hunger, suppressed for days, made itself known. The nervous system, deprived of its signals during the holiday's height, now demanded recognition. Sleep, deferred for duty, became an imperative. The quiet machinery of performance faltered when chemical reinforcement dissipated. The psychological weight was equally significant. Confidence, composure, and cheerfulness, once chemically assured, now appeared harder to summon. The mind, accustomed to seamless execution, struggled with the ordinary limitations of its corporeal vessel. Irritation surfaced, attention wavered, and the body's earlier compliance seemed fragile in retrospect. The illusion of effortless endurance, so carefully maintained for guests and observers, now revealed its dependence on hidden intervention. Victorian society did not accommodate such acknowledgement. Public display was complete, and the calendar offered no allowance for visible recuperation. The morning after was, paradoxically, both relief and subtle reprimand. The body's weakness could be privately attended, yet socially it remained unacceptable to dwell upon fatigue. To rest was permissible only behind closed doors, in shadows unobserved. The household resumed preparation for the next day, quietly demanding that composure continue. This moment highlighted the delicate balance between performance and intervention. The chemical scaffold that had carried the body through relentless engagement now receded, leaving vulnerability bare. It was a reminder that reliance had grown imperceptibly. What had seemed natural was now contingent. The body, though obedient for hours, remained human, signaling its limits too late for acknowledgement, yet persistently insisting upon recognition. By mid-morning, as the household stirred into routine once more, the traces of chemical aid, though absent, were not forgotten. Drawers remained prepared, snuff boxes refilled, vials kept ready for the next demand. The morning after Christmas confirmed a quiet truth. Endurance had a cost, chemical or otherwise. The season's performance had been flawless in appearance, but the body whispered its protest in tremors, aches, and the subtle weight of exhaustion, a reminder that the labor of propriety had never truly ended. Even in a society devoted to authority and trust, doubt occasionally crept into the sanctuaries of medicine. Victorian doctors, accustomed to prescribing remedies and observing compliance, were not blind to the subtleties of human response. Cocaine, initially celebrated for its ability to restore energy, clarity, and cheerfulness, began to provoke questions in the most cautious and meticulous minds. These were not loud proclamations of scandal. They were murmurs, private reservations recorded in journals, whispered between colleagues, and noted in clinical observations. The holiday season, with its intense demands, provided the first opportunity for reflection. Patients returned from weeks of ceaseless hosting, attending, and entertaining, reporting extraordinary endurance. Yet some displayed signs that did not align with the idealized narratives of recovery. Hands still trembled subtly despite reported doses. Eyes, bright during social gatherings, appeared dull and wary when unobserved. Fatigue returned with unusual rapidity once chemical assistance wore off. These anomalies, small and easily overlooked in the midst of performance, began to attract attention. Doctors, guided by the principles of observation and measurement, could not ignore these subtleties entirely. Clinical notes began to reflect hesitation. Was the body truly strengthened, or had it been coerced into compliance? Was improvement genuine, or merely a temporary suppression of natural signals? Each question was delicate. To challenge the prevailing enthusiasm for the powder risked professional censure, or the appearance of doubt in a substance already lauded in medical literature. Yet the observations persisted, impossible to dismiss entirely. Victorian medicine prized the predictable and measurable. The variance in patient responses presented a puzzle. Some individuals maintained energy without apparent strain. Others required increasingly frequent doses to achieve the same results. Journals began to record these inconsistencies with clinical detachment, noting that while initial benefits were undeniable, longer-term effects were less predictable. Some practitioners speculated about the possibility of habituation, though the language used remained cautious, respectful, and oblique. Addiction, dependency, and psychological reliance were rarely named outright. Christmas provided both proof and complication. The season demanded unbroken attention, and cocaine's efficacy under pressure was undeniable. Guests observed nothing but sustained grace and cheer, reinforcing the narrative that the substance functioned perfectly. Yet in private consultations, doctors noted subtle signs: insomnia persisting beyond social obligation, irritability when doses were missed, diminished appetite, and a restless agitation beneath composure. Each observation chipped slowly at the certainty that had surrounded the powder. These doubts, however quiet, began to influence practice. Physicians offered lower doses, encouraged moderation, and suggested observation. Some recommended complementary remedies, tonics, rest, or dietary adjustments to support the body alongside chemical intervention. There was an emerging awareness that the powder was not a panacea, that the body's limits could not be erased entirely, and that dependence, though invisible, was possible. Yet the season's demands continued unabated. Christmas, with its relentless schedule and social scrutiny, reinforced reliance on the powder. Even as doctors whispered caution, patients pressed forward with expectation. The tension between observation and necessity, between emerging doubt and social demand, defined the subtle moral landscape of Victorian high society. Cocaine remained effective, yet the first cracks in unquestioned faith had appeared, hinting at the costs that would one day be undeniable. The body, obedient during obligation, began to betray its quiet rebellion in moments unseen. The mind, confident in restored capacity, began to rely on repeated intervention, and the doctors, for all their expertise, could only note the signs with furrowed brows, uncertain how long the illusion of control could endure before revealing the true price of chemical compliance. The distinction between aid and necessity is often subtle, and in Victorian society it was easily blurred. Cocaine had entered the parlors and drawing rooms as a tool, a means of restoring energy, composure, and cheer during the relentless demands of Christmas. Initially, its use was framed as temporary, occasional, and rational, a calculated adjustment to meet societal expectation. Yet the very qualities that made it effective, immediacy, invisibility, and reliability, also made reliance inevitable. Aid transformed quietly into dependence. The transition was imperceptible at first. One dose was administered to manage fatigue during a long evening, a second to sustain attentiveness for an afternoon visit. The body responded as intended. The nerves steadied, hands no longer trembled, eyes regained their sparkle, and conversation flowed effortlessly. Each successful application reinforced the perception that control had been regained naturally. The user credited skill, discipline, or constitution rather than chemical assistance. The powder remained invisible, yet indispensable. Christmas accelerated this shift. Social obligations were dense and unyielding. Dinners, followed by visits, carols followed by games, prayers followed by gifts. Every hour required alertness, composure, and charm. The natural body, unassisted, struggled to meet these demands. Each time chemical aid restored performance, it subtly taught the mind that ordinary capacity was insufficient. Dependence grew without recognition, hidden beneath accomplishment and social approval. The consequences were immediate and silent. Nervous signals, once relied upon to signal fatigue or caution, were muted. Appetite and rest were suppressed. The body's subtle protests were overridden rather than attended. Each intervention created a temporary equilibrium, convincing the user that endurance was inherent, yet beneath the surface, the physiological cost accumulated. Nervous systems became habituated to stimulation. Natural rhythms were ignored, postponed, or disrupted. Performance was preserved, but autonomy eroded. Victorian culture, with its emphasis on self-discipline and composure, reinforced this pattern. The ideal host or hostess did not falter. Observers noted only the results: seamless charm, polished conversation, effortless grace. The means by which this performance was maintained, chemical or otherwise, remained irrelevant, unacknowledged, and invisible. Praise for skill and refinement further encouraged continued reliance. Success validated the intervention. Medical opinion, cautious yet complicit, offered reassurance. Physicians emphasized moderation, timing, and rational use, framing the substance as corrective rather than indulgent. Warnings of habit or overuse were couched in measured language, emphasizing responsible administration. Yet the subtle signs of reliance, increasing frequency, diminished efficacy, and latent craving were easily rationalized as seasonal necessity. The holiday itself justified repeated intervention. Psychologically, dependence manifested as trust rather than coercion. The mind came to anticipate chemical aid as part of preparation. Performance without it seemed impossible. The powder became both shield and scaffold, protection from social failure and support for continued excellence. Its absence created anxiety, subtle agitation, and diminished confidence. The individual could no longer disentangle natural capability from chemical reinforcement. By the conclusion of the season, what had begun as temporary aid had become habitual support. The powder was no longer merely a tool to meet extraordinary demands. It was woven into routine, expected, and relied upon. The illusion of effortless endurance persisted, but beneath it, dependence had quietly taken root. Christmas had not only tested social performance, it had taught the body and mind that survival, grace, and cheerfulness were contingent upon invisible chemical intervention. The season, it seemed, would never truly end, for its demands and its lessons endured in the very structure of reliance itself. In the parlors and drawing rooms of Victorian Christmas, a woman's composure was scrutinized relentlessly. The smallest tremor of hand, the briefest lapse in attention, or the slightest pallor could mark her as deficient, fragile, or morally suspect. Nervousness, fatigue, or melancholy were not interpreted as natural responses to the relentless demands of social expectation. They were interpreted as signs of disorder, weakness, or, in the harshest terms, hysteria. Christmas, with its unyielding calendar of calls, dinners, and performances, amplified this judgment, and cocaine's quiet influence entered this environment subtly, obscuring both cause and consequence. The diagnosis of hysteria was convenient. It converted natural exhaustion into a medical problem rather than a social one. A woman who could not sustain composure under long hours of hosting was said to be constitutionally fragile. If she exhibited irritability or melancholy, she was emotionally unstable. The language of medicine legitimized cultural expectation. The body and mind were blamed rather than the demands imposed upon them. To struggle was a failing of temperament, not evidence of overwork. The social system remained unchallenged. Cocaine, discreetly administered, masked the signs that would have drawn such labels. Tremors stilled, fatigue receded, attention sharpened. The effects were subtle but profound. A woman could complete evening calls, orchestrate dinners, manage conversation, and smile through musical performances without visible faltering. Her composure appeared innate, effortless, unassailable. The powder allowed her to meet expectation while evading the social censure that otherwise might have been inevitable. She appeared competent where her body had threatened to betray her. The irony was inescapable. The same chemical that preserved appearance also concealed the source of strain, making hysteria seem internal rather than imposed. Observers could note only success. Medical discourse, emphasizing correction of the nerves rather than alleviation of demands, reinforced the illusion. The powder's use remained invisible, the labor hidden, and the judgment avoided. The body's rebellion was temporarily silenced, and with it, the justification for criticism disappeared. Yet dependence formed quietly. Each successful evening reinforced trust in chemical assistance. A dose became routine, expected, almost procedural. The body learned to rely on intervention. Natural limits were ignored, signals suppressed, and nervous warnings overridden. Each repetition strengthened the association between performance and substance, and subtly redefined normality. What had once been a signal of need became a marker of inadequacy if left unassisted. This reliance was reinforced by societal reward. Women who maintained poise were praised for skill, refinement, and elegance. Their composure was cited as evidence of capability, rather than chemically maintained endurance. Those who faltered, however, risked being labeled hysterical, their fatigue attributed to moral or constitutional weakness rather than circumstance. The powder preserved social standing while silently enforcing conformity to impossible standards. Christmas, in its compressed intensity, ensured repetition and reinforcement. Success was visible, failure hidden, and the powder acted as mediator between human limitation and societal expectation. Its use allowed the season to proceed without scandal, yet at a subtle cost. Autonomy of body and mind was ceded incrementally, dependence normalized, and the line between natural capacity and chemically sustained endurance erased. Thus, women labeled hysterical were often those who dared to reveal fatigue, while those who concealed it with chemical aid were celebrated. The distinction was subtle, socially enforced, and entirely mediated by the invisible intervention that allowed the season and its unyielding expectations to continue without interruption. While women were scrutinized for composure, men were measured by endurance. Victorian society demanded that a gentleman sustain conversation, wit, and authority through the relentless pressures of Christmas, moving from drawing room to drawing room without faltering. To pause, to slow, or to show fatigue was to risk judgment. Failure to maintain energy and attentiveness suggested weakness, not of circumstance, but of character. And for men, the chemical ally that preserved performance became less a tool and more a necessity. Cocaine was quietly transformed from aid into compulsion. The pattern began subtly. One evening, a gentleman might administer a small dose to ensure clarity through dinner conversation, the next to maintain charm during long calls, the next to sustain attentiveness at evening entertainments. Each time the substance worked perfectly, masking fatigue, sharpening thought, and steadying nerves. The mind, reassured by consistent results, grew confident in its efficacy. Performance was preserved. Reputation remained intact. Success reinforced reliance. Christmas, with its dense schedule of obligations, ensured frequent application. Hours stretched, demands multiplied, and the body's natural limitations were consistently overridden. Where once a man might have paused or retreated, the powder enabled continued activity. The sensation of mastery became intertwined with chemical support. The body obeyed, the mind believed it was sovereign, and the line between voluntary use and dependency began to dissolve. Observation reinforced the cycle. Guests noticed vitality, wit, and charm, unaware of the invisible intervention that allowed it. Success validated use. Social approval disguised the emergent pattern. What began as occasional support became habitual, expected, and ultimately necessary for continued performance. The body, trained to function chemically, increasingly resisted its own natural rhythms, waiting instead for the predictable reinforcement. Medical framing further reinforced confidence. Doctors presented cocaine as a corrective, a means to restore balance in the nerves, an acceptable tool for the overtaxed gentleman. Reports and journals celebrated its efficacy in increasing attention, mental agility, and composure under social pressure. Concerns about habit were expressed cautiously, often as hypothetical or abstract possibilities. In practice, the substance's repeated use was normalized, protected by professional authority and cultural expectation. The psychological effect was profound. Each successful application strengthened the belief that endurance was contingent upon assistance. The gentleman came to expect that long evenings, complex conversations, and unbroken attention required chemical support. Moments of fatigue were interpreted not as natural limitation, but as deficiency of effort or preparation. The substance became the unseen guarantor of social competence, yet beneath the surface, dependence deepened. The nervous system, accustomed to intervention, demanded continuation. Subtle agitation, restlessness, and diminished confidence arose when doses were delayed or missed. What had begun as conscious choice became an almost automatic response. To perform, one must sustain chemical aid. The mind perceived mastery, yet the body's compliance was increasingly conditional. By the end of the season, The pattern was undeniable. Men who had relied on cocaine found themselves perpetually poised, endlessly attentive, seemingly impervious to the fatigue that would naturally accumulate. Success had a cost, invisible and deferred, yet immediate in its formation. The creation of dependence carefully concealed beneath appearances of vigor. In Victorian society, where performance equaled worth, the man who could not stop did so not by will alone, but by chemical compulsion, a truth as invisible as it was absolute. In Victorian high society, the guise of respectability served as both shield and justification. The use of cocaine, though quietly pervasive, rarely attracted scrutiny precisely because it was enmeshed within the rituals, aesthetics, and authority of the elite. The powder was not illicit, nor was it concealed in shadowed alleys. It existed within the bounds of propriety, measured, discreet, and sanctioned by the very culture that demanded endurance, composure, and charm. In this environment, respectability protected the powder, allowing dependence to flourish unnoticed. The appearance of order lent credibility. Chemists' shops were neat, well lit, and located on polite streets. Doctors prescribed the substance with professional language and authority. Its packaging, glass vials, snuff boxes, silk-lined drawers, mirrored the refinement of its users, disguising potential hazard beneath elegance. A hostess's drawer or a gentleman's pocket became repositories of necessity, not indulgence. Observers noted only the visible mastery of energy and grace, never the chemical aid that enabled it. Victorian culture itself reinforced this protection. Social norms equated appearance with virtue. Composure, attentiveness, and charm were interpreted as evidence of character. A woman who orchestrated a flawless dinner, or a man who maintained wit late into the evening, was praised for innate capability. The presence of cocaine, hidden beneath the veneer of performance, was never suspected. Its efficacy was attributed to discipline, training, or natural constitution, not to chemical intervention. The moral authority of medicine further shielded use. Physicians framed cocaine as a corrective, a temporary aid to nervous exhaustion, a tool for aligning body and mind with the demands of social expectation. Journals and treatises praised its efficacy while minimizing potential risks. Reliance could be rationalized as responsible, moderation as virtue. The combination of professional endorsement and social decorum rendered critique almost impossible. To question the substance was to question judgment, refinement, and authority simultaneously. Christmas intensified the effect. The season demanded performance beyond ordinary human capacity. Prolonged hosting, extended conversation, and meticulous attention to ritual. The powder allowed individuals to meet these expectations flawlessly, preserving appearances while the body's natural limits were overridden. Success confirmed propriety. Those who used it did so without visible compromise. Those who faltered were quietly judged as lacking constitution, further reinforcing the need for chemical support. Dependency remained hidden by repetition and discretion. Each successful evening strengthened the belief that chemical aid was natural, rational, and necessary. Habits formed under the guise of necessity, invisible to observers and reinforced by societal reward. The more the powder enabled compliance with expectation, the less it was questioned by self or others. The veneer of respectability rendered reliance morally and socially acceptable. Even when subtle signs of strain emerged, tremor, agitation, fatigue, they were interpreted within existing cultural frameworks. A woman's pallor was a delicate constitution. A man's restless hand was nervous energy, not chemical consequence. Respectability, with its emphasis on outward perfection, obscured causality. The powder's influence was invisible precisely because society rewarded the results it produced. By the end of the season, the lesson was clear. In a world where appearance equaled worth, the powder's success was self-perpetuating. Respectability protected its use, shielding dependence from scrutiny and ensuring continuity. Chemical aid became not a secret vice, but an invisible extension of social virtue, allowing performance to remain flawless while the body quietly bore its unseen burden. The season itself became a mechanism, subtle yet unyielding, that compelled reliance. Christmas, with its unrelenting obligations and rigid expectations, was not merely a time of celebration, it was a recurring test, a social accelerant that amplified both fatigue and the need for chemical assistance. Each year, the same patterns unfolded: long days of hosting, endless calls, meticulously choreographed dinners, and unbroken vigilance through evening entertainments. For those who had discovered the powder's efficacy, the season served as a trigger, subtly conditioning the body and mind to anticipate intervention. The cycle began predictably. The first evenings of social engagement revealed limitations: hands that trembled slightly, minds that wandered, voices that faltered. Initial doses restored poise. Confidence returned, conversation flowed, laughter, wit, and charm were reinstated. Success reinforced behavior. The mind encoded a simple equation: when expectation exceeds natural capacity, chemical assistance ensures compliance. This association, once formed, became increasingly automatic with each passing December. The recurring nature of Christmas amplified the effect. Unlike ordinary periods of stress, the holiday's demands were not flexible. The calendar dictated a schedule, and tradition demanded performance. Guests arrived regardless of weather, fatigue, or health. Social hierarchy enforced participation. Even brief lapses carried social consequence. In such an environment, reliance on cocaine was not merely convenient, it was rationalized as essential. The body learned to anticipate both strain and intervention simultaneously. Women, in particular, experienced heightened reinforcement. Their roles demanded orchestration of households, attention to every detail of etiquette, and the management of multiple social relationships simultaneously. Chemical aid enabled these performances, making exhaustion tolerable and composure seamless. The positive feedback, praise, admiration, and the absence of censure strengthened the association between powder and successful navigation of the season. Dependency, initially intermittent, became habitual. Men, similarly, internalized the trigger. Long dinners, extended social calls, and expectations of charm and authority created a pressure that was relieved chemically. Cocaine allowed sustained energy, clear thought, and controlled expression. Each triumph reinforced the perceived necessity of use. By the midpoint of the holiday, the body, previously resistant, anticipated intervention almost reflexively. The season itself had trained it to respond chemically. This conditioning extended beyond immediate relief. Nervous systems, repeatedly overridden during periods of high demand, adjusted to the expectation that assistance would arrive. Fatigue cues, subtle tremors, and mental lapses, the natural signals intended to regulate behavior, were increasingly ignored or suppressed. The powder became a stabilizer, ensuring performance remained continuous while internal warning systems were muted. The psychological effect was equally potent. Users came to associate success with intervention rather than effort alone. Confidence, charm, and composure, previously the product of natural resilience or preparation, were now perceived as contingent upon chemical aid. The season, recurring and unchanging, reinforced this dependency, making the powder an invisible companion for each successive December. By the end of Christmas, the trigger had been activated fully. The season's demands, encoded in ritual, social expectation, and personal memory, ensured that reliance was repeated, habitual, and internalized. What began as assistance had evolved into necessity. Each return of snow, carol, and candlelight reminded the body and mind alike. The season will demand perfection, and perfection is only achievable with the powder quietly at hand. The holiday, for all its cheer, had become both test and enforcer conditioning endurance while masking its cost beneath elegance, ritual, and propriety. At first, cocaine was celebrated as a marvel. Victorian medicine lauded its ability to restore energy, sharpen attention, and lift spirits. Social observers remarked on the vitality it seemed to confer, and users credited it with enabling seamless participation in the endless rituals of Christmas. It appeared miraculous, a substance that could correct fatigue, steady nerves, and restore composure at a moment's notice. Yet miracles, once repeated and relied upon, often reveal their shadow. The transformation from aid to menace was gradual, imperceptible to those most closely engaged. The very qualities that made cocaine effective, rapid onset, invisibility, and reliability, also ensured that reliance deepened without recognition. Each successful evening reinforced trust. Each dose delivered the expected result. The body, repeatedly assisted, ceased to function fully on its own. Signals of fatigue, hunger, and stress were silenced. Nervous warnings that once prevented overexertion were now deferred, postponed, or ignored. The powder masked cost, while performance remained flawless. The first signs of menace appeared subtly. The same dose that once sufficed began to feel less effective. Tremors returned sooner, concentration lapsed more quickly, and irritability emerged if the powder was delayed. The body, conditioned to intervention, began to demand it. What had been occasional, rational assistance became habitual necessity. Dependence had formed quietly, hidden beneath the surface of impeccable composure. Social expectation exacerbated the problem. Christmas left no allowance for pause or reflection. Guests arrived, dinners unfolded, visits continued, and performance was non-negotiable. The culture valued appearance over process, rewarding sustained energy and charm while ignoring the invisible toll. Success, even chemically supported, was praised. Failure, subtle and private, was condemned. The powder enabled continued approval, but at the cost of autonomy. Medical authorities, previously enthusiastic, began to recognize irregularities. Case notes recorded repeated use, increased dosage, and subtle behavioral changes. Insomnia, agitation, loss of appetite, and restlessness were noted, though often attributed to individual constitution or seasonal stress rather than chemical consequence. Journals cautioned sparingly, their language hedged in propriety and deferential to the authority of practice. Publicly, the substance retained its aura of reliability and respectability. Privately, the first hints of menace were acknowledged, yet largely unaddressed. For users, the psychological impact was profound. Confidence, composure, and alertness became contingent on intervention. The mind associated performance not with effort or resilience, but with chemical assistance. The body, deprived of natural cues, was trained to anticipate aid. The illusion of mastery persisted even as dependence deepened. What had been a solution now controlled expectation. The season, society, and self demanded continuation. By the end of the holiday, the shift was complete. The miracle had become a requirement. The powder no longer merely assisted, it dictated. Its effects, once celebrated, now enforced compliance. Users relied upon it to sustain social performance, preserve reputation, and maintain the appearance of effortless grace. The body, once capable of natural resilience, had been conditioned to obedience. Autonomy had been ceded imperceptibly in exchange for continuity of performance. Christmas, initially a proving ground for chemical aid, had become a crucible of dependence. What began as wonder had quietly evolved into menace, disguised beneath polish, ritual, and propriety. The powder, invisible yet indispensable, ensured that appearances remained perfect even as the cost deepened. In the homes of the elite, the line between miracle and danger had been crossed, and, in its crossing, the season's cheer concealed a truth far more enduring and insidious than any candlelight could illuminate. No matter how carefully concealed, some truths find their way into daylight. Cocaine, long hidden within snuff boxes, silk-lined drawers, and discreet vials, had allowed Victorian society to maintain the illusion of effortless composure. It had enabled hosts and hostesses to navigate endless obligations, sustained conversation, and endure the rigorous scrutiny of guests, all while masking fatigue and nervous strain. For years, its presence remained invisible, its operation unremarked upon. Yet the very success of this concealment ensured that the secret could not remain buried indefinitely. Whispers began subtly. Observers noticed that some hosts appeared unnaturally tireless, that laughter persisted long after natural energy should have waned. Servants, attuned to nuance, remarked privately on the precision of gestures and the steadiness of hands, noting the quiet repetition that made grace seem mechanical. Friends and acquaintances compared notes discreetly, intrigued by how certain individuals managed the season with unbroken vigor, while others faltered. The question arose, though rarely articulated aloud: how was this composure maintained? Medical discourse, too, contributed to the slow revelation. Journals that had praised cocaine's efficacy began to include caveats. Case studies noted increasing frequency of use, diminished effect with repeated administration, and subtle signs of agitation or insomnia. Practitioners observed dependence forming quietly, though still cloaked in professional language. The miracle had begun to reveal its double edge. What enabled social perfection also created reliance that could no longer be ignored. Christmas, recurring with relentless precision, magnified both need and visibility. The powder's users returned annually, expected to sustain performance under identical pressures. Their bodies had learned to anticipate chemical assistance. Their minds associated success with intervention. Any lapse, missed dose, or deviation in timing became apparent not only in behavior, but in confidence and composure. Small cracks appeared, noticeable to those who observed carefully, raising curiosity and eventually concern. Society, though reluctant to confront the truth, began to acknowledge patterns. The very structure that had shielded reliance, respectability, discretion, and professional authority paradoxically highlighted it when comparisons were made. Families observed that some hosts could manage multi-hour gatherings flawlessly year after year, while others of similar background and training showed obvious fatigue. Guests began to speculate, quietly, about the invisible means that enabled such endurance. The secret, while still unnamed, was visible in its effects. The revelation was gradual and incomplete. No one spoke openly of chemical dependence, yet the awareness spread through implication. The powder's protection relied on silence. Once discussion arose, concealment became tenuous. Its users understood the unspoken scrutiny, yet were unable to abandon the very aid that had preserved appearances. Dependence and discretion intertwined, ensuring the secret endured in practice even as it began to emerge in observation. By the close of the holiday season, the paradox was undeniable. The powder had sustained social grace, preserved reputation, and enabled composure beyond natural endurance. Yet its presence, once invisible, had begun to cast shadows. The secret could not remain fully buried. Whispers, subtle observations, and professional notes hinted at the truth. The chemical that had made the season tolerable also ensured that the body and mind were quietly enmeshed in reliance. The illusion of effortless mastery persisted, but the secret had begun to leak into daylight, threatening to undermine the very propriety it had been designed to protect. In the quiet aftermath, the powder remained hidden, yet its inevitability was apparent. Its power, its necessity, and the dependence it fostered were no longer entirely invisible, a truth that society would learn to manage delicately, as carefully as it had measured every gesture, every smile, and every whisper of the season itself. The last candle flickered in the drawing room, and snow pressed silently against frost-lined windows. Christmas had concluded outwardly. Dinners finished, carols sung, guests departed. Yet the season's work remained, unseen, unacknowledged, and unrelenting. Behind every gesture of grace, every effortless smile, every polished interaction, there lay a hidden scaffolding, the invisible architecture of chemical aid that had sustained it all. The season, it seemed, had been built not merely on tradition, ritual, or social expectation, but upon powder. Victorian society, ever attentive to appearances, celebrated performance without regard to the mechanisms that enabled it. Hosts and hostesses navigated days of unbroken social obligation, orchestrated dinners, and endless visits with apparent composure. Their movements were precise, their speech articulate, their eyes bright and attentive. To the observer, the season had passed flawlessly, a testament to discipline, refinement, and innate strength. Few suspected the quiet intervention that had made such endurance possible. Cocaine, discreetly administered, had acted as an invisible ally throughout. It steadied hands that would otherwise have trembled. It sharpened thoughts that might otherwise have wandered. It masked fatigue, tempered nerves, and allowed charm to persist under conditions that would have naturally worn any human body thin. The powder's influence ensured that composure could be maintained without interruption, enabling social obligations to proceed uninterrupted and appearances to remain immaculate. Yet its role extended beyond mere facilitation. The substance shaped behavior, perception, and expectation alike. Those who used it came to associate performance with chemical support. Confidence, grace, and attention were interpreted as natural, though they were chemically mediated. Fatigue, when suppressed, was denied. Nervous signals that might have prompted pause were silenced, creating the illusion of endless endurance. In effect, the season was not merely performed, it was engineered, carefully calibrated, and maintained through intervention invisible to all but the user. Dependence, subtle and gradual, had emerged unnoticed. Each successful evening reinforced reliance. The mind learned to anticipate intervention, the body to obey it. The chemical scaffold became normalized, internalized, and expected. What began as temporary assistance evolved into habitual support, a quiet mechanism ensuring that performance remained flawless year after year. The illusion of effortlessness persisted, while the cost accumulated silently within the body and mind. Victorian ideals of propriety and self-discipline provided moral cover for this reliance. The powder was framed as aid, medicine, correction, not indulgence. Observers praised composure without questioning the source. Authority reinforced trust. The social calendar and its relentless obligations further justified use. In every success, every polished dinner, every satisfied guest, the invisible intervention was reinforced and rewarded. Thus, the holiday's perfection was built upon chemistry. Every interaction, every smile, every measured gesture owed its continuity to unseen assistance. The season's triumphs were real, but they were inseparable from the powder that had sustained them. Without it, exhaustion would have been visible, nerves frayed, attention lost, and composure betrayed. What appeared effortless was, in truth, carefully engineered, the body's natural limitations overridden, and social expectation preserved. As the final guests departed and quiet returned to the house, the powder remained in its place, waiting for the next season, the next demand, the next test. Christmas had passed, yet its lessons endured. Appearances could be preserved, obligations met, and social grace maintained, provided the chemical ally remained close at hand. The holiday, long celebrated for tradition and ritual, had been sustained and secured by science, discretion, and intervention, invisible to all. The season's perfection, now revealed in retrospect, was built entirely upon chemistry, hidden beneath lace, gaslight, and the polished surfaces of Victorian expectation.